Chapter 866. The complicated orders were passed down as soon as the domain was broken. The chaotic battle situation remained the same. The soldiers of the Volcano Legion were still rushing forward desperately. Orders were given one after another, from the regiment level to the company level. The soldiers of each class received clear orders. The chaotic battlefield was changing quietly. Emperor Dong's palace began to assemble, and the Volcano Legion also became a whole under the orders one after another. Lin Yuxian was still in the front. Covered in blood, he stood straight, like a divine sword that could tear the sky. A streak of scarlet sword light shone in the surging crowd. The sword light was like water, and the sword energy was like a tide. In everyone's line of sight, a blood-colored arc of light appeared in midair. The arc of light reflected the sunlight and expanded rapidly. Lin Yuxian, whose essence, qi, and spirit had reached the peak, held a long sword in his hand. He raised the sword edge and said coldly, "Kill them all." Where the long sword pointed, the weapon pointed. The huge bloody arc of light directly cut into the crowd with unimaginable murderous intent. The world seemed to turn red. The desert became a sea of blood. Lin Yuxian strode forward. Endless sword energy surged around him, gathered like a dragon, and went on a rampage. The space was torn by the sword energy inch by inch. Countless dense sounds burst out at the same time and swept across the battlefield like a dragon's roar. This was the Dragon Fist. Lin Yuxian's own sword energy dragon fist. Countless dragon-shaped sword energy surged wildly around him with unparalleled sharpness. Lin Yuxian rushed to the front. Charge, charge, charge! Under the dragon-shaped sword energy, all the obstacles in front of him were broken. Lin Yuxian was bathed in blood and almost became a bloody man. Under his leadership, the entire Nightmare Legion was like a sharp sword again, piercing into the defense of the Volcano Legion without reservation. They moved forward with indomitable will, destroying all obstacles. Is that Lin Yuxian? The tent in the center of the Volcano Legion's base was converted into a temporary command room. Through the screen, the commander of the Volcano Legion quietly watched the extremely tragic battle situation. His expression was as hard as iron. On the other screen, Lin Dong, the commander of the fierce Tiger Armored Corps, who was fighting with the Volcano Legion, frowned and said in a dignified tone. Yang Xiaoxiong did not speak and just stared at the screen. "Old Yang, we can't go on like this. The Volcano Legion can't hold on any longer. This person is not much worse than Li Tianlan 3 years ago." Lin Dong said in a low voice. "It's still not enough," Yang Xiaoxiong said slowly. He was a rare superior of the half-step invincible realm in the Beijiang military region, so he naturally had better eyesight. But on the current battlefield, that bit of difference is meaningless. Lin Dong looked at Yang Xiaoxiong seriously. Yang Xiaoxiong was silent for a moment before he shook his head. Sighing softly, he said, "The quality of the army still can't keep up. I can maintain their will and fighting spirit, but something like strength is not something that can be obtained just because you want it." "What are you going to do?" Lin Dong asked. "We can only fight." Yang Xiaoxiong raised his eyebrows. He wasn't handsome, but he was extremely tough. "We can only fight to the death." Lin Dong was silent for a long time. After a long time, he softly said, "Is that necessary? We don't have a choice. As soldiers, we should carry out orders. And none of US can say that such orders are wrong. The existence of Beihai does harm the interests of Zhongzhou State to some extent. Emperor Dong's palace is another Beihai. We really can't let them grow. As for the right or wrong of this war, that's a problem of decision-making. I'm the commander of the Volcano Corps. The only thing I can do is carry out orders." He looked at Lin Dong and smiled, which was rare. "The next step is up to you." "What do you mean?" Lin Dong frowned. "When they rush through the line of defense of the Volcano Corps, the firepower of the Tiger Armored Corps can be maximized. There's no need for any estimation. Just destroy everything directly. Only in this way will today's sacrifice be worth it. An army of tens of thousands of people will get rid of the cancer in the future for Zhongzhou State. In fact, this is a fair deal. Do you really have no concerns at all? Lin Dong looked at him. You should know Minister Dongqing's opinion on this matter. Don't forget, you're also a soldier of the Border Control Corps. I'm a soldier of Zhongzhou State, Yang Xiaoxiong said coldly. He narrowed his eyes, and a complicated look flashed across his eyes. He said softly, "It's all over." Lin Dong wanted to say something more, but Yang Xiaoxiong had already turned off the communication. He looked at the screen. On the screen, the dragon-shaped sword energy raged wildly. Blood and corpses piled up crazily all the way. The entire Nightmare Corps was advancing forward at an unimaginable speed. If there were no accidents, the other party would soon be able to push into his command room. The gap in hard strength was indeed not something that could be solved by fighting intent. Moreover, at this point in the battle, no matter how strong the willpower of the Volcano Corps was, the formation was a little scattered. Yang Xiaoxiong's eyes wandered a little and looked at the side of Lin Yuxian. He took a deep breath and suddenly rose into the air. The tent of the headquarters was directly torn apart. The desert wind blew in with yellow sand. It was desolate. Now is not the time to hold back. Lin Yuxian repeated this sentence again. But this time, this sentence was not for the Nightmare Corps. It was for the people around him. What is the meaning of this war? We can't know until the war is over. His tone was very serious and a little confused. Beside him, Bai Yuming said, Are you all right? The invisible sword light shuttled wildly in the front line, forming a straight line. The sword light was so fast that it was stained with blood all the way. The whole front line became a red line as the sword light passed. Li Beitian stopped beside Bai Yuming and asked with a slight frown. Everyone could feel that there was something wrong with Bai Yuming. She was the only superior of the half-step invincible realm in the high level of Emperor Dong's palace. But in this war, she did not play the role that a superior of the half-step invincible realm should have. Everyone was saving strength and physical strength at the beginning. But now, it was time to show their trump cards. I'm all right. Bai Yuming shook her head hard. She looked at the battlefield in front of her. Looking at the ferocious and fearful enemies that were charging at him, Lin Fan felt a chill run down his spine. Zhongzhou State. Enemies. The combination of these two words almost completely subverted Bai Yuming's worldview. She really didn't understand why things became like this, and she didn't want to meet the army in front of her. The Volcano Corps. Who would be responsible for the blood and corpses that flowed on the desert today? The soldiers of the Volcano Legion had gone completely crazy. They formed a human tide, and the human tide pushed everyone forward. Everyone rushed forward like crazy, attacking, and dying. Death became insignificant in the war. It was so insignificant that everyone didn't seem to care. They were not afraid of death. The only purpose of everyone rushing over seemed to be to attack, even if this kind of attack was meaningless. For soldiers, the greatest meaning of war is life and death. Live to win, or die to win. Apart from that, there is no other meaning. Now that you're standing on a battlefield, don't think about the meaning behind the war. That's none of your business. Look at the enemies in front of you. They're doing everything they can to take your life. Put away all the weakness in your character. Pick up your sword and kill your way over. There are only two kinds of people who die on the battlefield. Those who die in the hands of the enemies on the battlefield are heroes. Those who die because of weakness are fools. Come on, I'll teach you a move. Watch carefully. This move may not be worse than the kendo of your jade pool. Remember the meaning of your existence. On the battlefield, the only and the whole meaning of your existence is to carry out orders. Kill them with me, for Zhongzhou State. While he was in a trance, many images flashed in his mind. Bai Yuming looked at the enemy in front of her. She took a deep breath and laughed. An extremely soft, long sword appeared in her hand, and the clear blade trembled violently. I'm fine. She looked at Lin Yuxian and then at Li Beitian and affirmed again. Li Beitian nodded. His figure drifted, and the sword light flashed. Another light that was much brighter than the great void sword suddenly burst out from Bai Yuming. Bai Yuming's body disappeared. The ethereal sword light was still shuttling on the battlefield. The dragon-shaped sword energy tore the world apart. The soft sword straightened in an instant. On the battlefield of blood and bones, an extremely bright sword light ran through the distance of hundreds of meters in an instant. It was swift, bright, and gorgeous. The bright sword light pushed forward crazily, instantly surpassing Lin Yuxian and Li Beitian. Afterimages appeared one after another on the battlefield. The afterimages of people and the afterimages of swords. Countless soldiers of the volcano core evaporated in an instant in the sword light. The super-destructive power and the dazzling sword light attracted the attention of most people in an instant. Yang Xiaoxiong, who had risen from the command room, also saw this scene. An incomparably cold, murderous intent flashed across his eyes. Only a few people recognized this sword move. This was the unique skill of Jade Pool. The glimpse of Aurora, the sword light, and the afterimages of people moved forward in the crowd. In Yang Xiaoxiong's sight, the sword light that was moving forward suddenly rose up. Bai Yoming's figure went into the sky with a white line that tore the desert apart. Heaven-breaking rainbow sword. The falling point of this sword was sinister and vicious. But for Emperor Dong's palace, the falling point of this sword was perfect. If this sword fell on the ground, the sword energy would be so mighty that the volcano core in the entire area would no longer have the ability to fight. High in the sky, the sword energy was like a rainbow, and the woman was like a dragon. At this moment, Bai Yuming had an unparalleled elegance. Yang Xiaoxiong suddenly snorted. When the rainbow-like sword light fell, he was already standing in the center of the sword energy. The sound of metal rubbing rang out in the desert. In the chaotic battlefield, a large amount of yellow sand suddenly flew into the air and built an earth wall. The sword light in the sky became brighter and brighter, smashing the earth wall on the ground all the way down. The earthen walls, which were as thick as a city, lit up with thunder-like blue light. The light shone in the sun with indescribable coldness. Yang Xiaoxiong stood in the center of the light. He held a long saber in his hand. In the hundreds of years of history of the Dark World, the pinnacle of martial arts had always been swordsmanship. The swordsmanship of Beihai, the swordsmanship of the Li family, the swordsmanship of the Lin clan. In the entire Zhongzhou state, only one martial arts force was used to using sabers. A force that had almost been suppressed in recent years and had almost no sense of existence in the shadow of Sai City. Azura Path in the northeast. That was also Yang Xiaoxiong's sect. The dazzling sword light pierced straight down. Yang Xiaoxiong raised the long saber in his hand. In the heroic roar, with Yang Xiaoxiong as the center, all the soldiers of the volcano core within a distance of tens of meters were pushed out. The crazy thunderbolts kept gathering in the space of tens of meters. The blade tore the space and went all the way up. The thunderbolts surged into a huge saber light of tens of meters and slashed at Bai Yuming from top to bottom. Tragic, crazy, and domineering. This had always been the essence of Azura Path. The extremely condensed thunderbolts turned into saber radiance, splitting the world and the sword light. The sword energy and the saber radiance collided fiercely. In a loud roar, Bai Yoming's body was lifted into the sky by the huge impact from the bottom up. Her figure was completely stretched in the sky and turned into a graceful white shadow. Elegant, quiet, clear, and otherworldly. The whole battlefield seemed to be quiet for a moment. Only the sword energy swept through the world and surged in all directions. Yang Xiaoxiong raised his head and looked at the extremely beautiful figure in the sky. Lin Yuxian raised his head and felt the sword light that could even make him feel the fatal danger. He narrowed his eyes. Li Beitian stopped, looked at the sky, and whispered, "Oh, Jade Pool." Above the sky, Bai Yoming's figure flew higher and higher. In the indescribable silence, a group of soldiers of the volcano core couldn't help but charge. As soon as their bodies moved, they were instantly torn apart by the sword energy gathered on the ground. Everyone raised their heads. The dancing figure was the end of all the sword energy. This was the strongest sword move of the 7 absolute swords of Jade Pool. It was also the peak sword move of a half-step invincible realm expert. Bai Yoming's figure paused in the sky for a moment. Her clothes fluttered, the sword edge trembled, and the sword light flew. The tip of the straight soft sword was raised little by little and pointed at Yang Xiaoxiong. Yang Xiaoxiong, whose body was tense to the extreme, held the long saber with both hands and put on a completely defensive posture. Bai Yuming glanced at him. Her figure disappeared in the sky in an instant. The next second, the unimaginable sword energy on the ground kept surging toward the sky. The space seemed to be torn apart. The colorful light was constantly shining in the sky, like rosy clouds. In the rosy clouds, there seemed to be thousands of white shadows flashing constantly. Countless white shadows occupied every direction and every corner, as if there were countless Bai Yuming waving the sword at Yang Xiaoxiong at the same time. That was a completely unimaginable picture. Gorgeous, treacherous, dangerous, fierce. This was the strongest sword move of Jade Pool. It was also known as the most gorgeous sword light in the dark world. In the hands of a half-step invincible realm expert, this sword move perfectly interpreted its name. Jade Pool, Heavenly Fairy. The surging thunder light was completely shattered in an instant. The saber radiance disappeared inch by inch. Li Beitian narrowed his eyes and seemed to realize that something was wrong. But before he could see clearly, Lin Yuxian beside him suddenly said, F***CK. Before his voice fell to the ground, his figure had suddenly turned into a residual shadow, and his body, like a hurricane, came directly to Bai Yuming. The fierce sword energy suddenly spread and shattered the last saber radiance in Yang Xiaoxiong's hand. Lin Yuxian had half-held Bai Yuming and retreated. His face was gloomy and annoyed. He stared at Bai Yuming and said angrily, Do you know what you are doing? Li Beitian froze and wanted to speak, but he held back. Bai Yuming was silent, without saying a word. Her white clothes had been completely dyed red by blood. 3 huge wounds were still bleeding profusely. One was on the back waist, one on the chest, and the other on the abdomen. The blood was like a fountain flowing continuously. Bai Yoming's face was pale. She looked in the direction of Yang Xiaoxiong and smiled softly. That smile was extremely sad and desperate. Li Beitian glanced at Yang Xiaoxiong in the distance. Yang Xiaoxiong still stood there, expressionless. Countless blood spots appeared all over his body. From his forehead to his chest to his abdomen, they were all over his body. But each blood spot was very light. For a half-step invincible realm expert, such an injury was not even a flesh wound. Do you know him? Li Beitian frowned and looked at Bai Yuming. Few people in the entire Zhongzhou state could resist the Heavenly Fairy just now. Bai Yoming's sword could touch Yang Xiaoxiong, which meant that she had the ability to kill Yang Xiaoxiong with every sword move just now. But in the end, her sword only made contact with him for a split second, and her opponent had almost taken her life when she had deliberately held back. Bai Yuming bit her lip and did not speak. In the distance, Yang Xiaoxiong, expressionless, raised his long saber, and his new order spread to the whole area. The order we received was to stop the Nightmare Troop and prevent them from entering the prison. But now, comrades, there is no turning back. So from this moment on, the order has been changed. Volcano Troop, listen to the order. All charge. Die here with the Nightmare Troop. Kill. In the soaring roar, countless soldiers of the Volcano Troop rushed up with red eyes. Bai Yuming wrapped the wound on her body and looked up at Yang Xiaoxiong. Yang Xiaoxiong's eyes were calm and cruel as before. Bai Yuming laughed again. You take a rest first, we no need. Bai Yuming interrupted Lin Yuxian. Let me do it. He looked back at Fairy Tail and said lightly, Give me your weapon. Fairy Tail was stunned and handed over the weapon hesitantly. It was a long saber, nearly 2 meters long. Bai Yuming held the hilt of the saber and looked at Yang Xiaoxiong in the distance. Come on, I'll teach you a move. Watch carefully. This move may not be worse than the kendo of your Jade Pool. She thought of the words in her memory, smiled softly, and said softly, I've learned this move. The saber was held in her hand. Her slender figure carried the huge long saber and moved forward slowly, faster and faster. The huge blade was swung in her hand. Her figure began to charge. From quick-witted to crazy, it was only a moment. Her body and the saber directly collided with the endless group of soldiers of the volcano troop. The blade was raised, and with an indescribable weight, it swung down like lightning. In the crowd, Bai Yuming suddenly let out a scream that pierced through the sky. The crazy blade suddenly spun wildly in the crowd. All her physical strength, willpower, strength, and speed were gathered together and completely burned in the most crazy and violent way. Invincible realm, Li Baiyan's face suddenly changed. The huge blade swept through the crowd with an unimaginable bloody storm, and all who stood in its way were defeated. At this moment, Bai Yuming seemed to have really stepped into the invincible realm. No real breakthrough. Fairy Tail stared at Bai Yuming's figure with a complicated look in his eyes. This is, he smiled bitterly. Azura Path, Doubtless Madness. Doubtless Madness. The strongest saber of Azura Path, and also the forbidden saber of Azura Path. In the distance, the irrational saber light unscrupulously slaughtered everything and rushed to Yang Xiaoxiong. Along the way, it was like Azura hell. Mutilated corpses were scattered all over the place. The bloody storm rushed into the crowd, killed its way out of the crowd, and almost cleared everything along the way. The storm that was condensed to the extreme suddenly shrank for a moment. The huge blade came to Yang Xiaoxiong. This saber was no longer a hack. It was a forward stab. Yang Xiaoxiong did not dodge. Facing the blade, he took a step forward. Bai Yuming, whose eyes were red and completely irrational, held the long saber and directly cut open Yang Xiaoxiong's chest. His face was gloomy, but he showed a rare smile. Good learning. He looked at Bai Yuming and said with a smile, "You deserve to be my soldier." Bai Yuming's eyes trembled for a moment, and she seemed to regain some clarity. She looked at the man in front of her, closed her eyes, and opened them again. "Commander, I'm not your commander anymore," Yang Xiaoxiong whispered. Bai Yuming's palm trembled violently. Yang Xiaoxiong's breath gradually weakened, and he tried to smile. "I like the army very much, but I'm really tired of being a soldier. The question you asked me that year, I don't have an answer. But if there's a next life, Yuming, I will marry you." His body slowly fell with the last voice. Endless thunder spread around him, bringing up yellow sand all over the sky. Chapter 867. Bai Yuming watched Yang Xiaoxiong fall in front of her. The incomparably tyrannical saber radiance penetrated deep into his internal organs, constantly eroding his flesh and blood. Lightning filled the sky with Yang Xiaoxiong as the center. It was a power that he had been accumulating for a long time, but he had never used it in the end. The light continued to spread, rolling over Bai Yuming's body. It was as gentle as that night at the border of Hung State many years ago, when he held her seriously injured and crossed the mountains in the heavy encirclement and returned to the territory of Zhongzhou State. The lightning isolated the desert from the outside world. The long-condensed power of the half-step invincible realm was dazzling and majestic. Bai Yuming held the knife in her hand tightly and cried loudly in the endless thunder. Yang Xiaoxiong's body was slowly dissipating. He lay on the ground and looked up at the sky through the lightning. The blazing sun was slowly setting. The setting sun lit up the sky, bringing with it a large sunset glow. His eyes were a little dazed, but he appeared extremely calm. "Leader," Bai Yuming shouted again. The story between her and Yang Xiaoxiong was far from touching. More than a decade ago, the little girl, who had achieved primary success in kendo but had a weak personality, was only 18 years old when she was thrown into the Border Control Corps by her father. That year, Yang Xiaoxiong was 27 years old. Her father stuffed her into the Border Control Corps. He was then transferred to the Thunderbolt Battalion by his uncle, who was the commander of the army. Yang Xiaoxiong was her first guild leader. The 27-year-old commander of the Thunderbolt Battalion of the Border Control Corps could be said to have a promising future. Yang Xiaoxiong was also in high spirits. At that time, Bai Yuming was not a soldier or an officer, but a staff officer of Yang Shaoxiong's Yinlei group. At that time, Bai Yuming was weak, sentimental, and loved to cry. It was Yang Shaoxiong, an officer who came from the Prince group, but was valued by the Border Control Corps, who slowly turned her into a soldier. She liked to see him charging forward on the battlefield. She liked to watch him fight with the soldiers in his free time. He liked to see him stand in front of his troops again and again in the face of danger. She liked it even more when he dared to enter the enemy country alone to save his subordinate, who had made a mistake because of his subordinate's mistake. His entire body and mind were devoted to the army. At that time, Bai Yuming didn't even dare to confess to him. He was quiet and stable in the Thunderbolt Battalion. From regiment commander, deputy division commander to division commander, he rose to the top of the world. Bai Yuming had always been by his side as his combat advisor. His countless military exploits in the Thunderbolt Battalion made him more and more valued. In the end, Dong Xingwudi personally nominated Yang Shaoxiong to the army headquarters. Yang Shaoxiong crossed the threshold of the deputy army and was transferred to the Beijiang military region as the commander of the Volcano Corps. In Bai Yuming's memory, she seemed to have only confessed once. That is, when he was about to leave the Border Control Corps. She drank a lot that day. "Do you like me?" "Yes, I like everyone in the army," Wang Yao said. "That's not what I meant. If I like you, then I like you. In my eyes, the most beautiful thing is always in the military." "Oh, let's go." "Goodbye." They said goodbye, but never saw each other again. Several years seemed to have passed, or perhaps many years. Bai Yuming didn't think that her first love was a failure. Maybe she had never succeeded, and it was not unforgettable at all. Her life went on. Yang Shaoxiong's figure faded little by little, and her emotions also faded little by little. She began to appreciate every soldier. The Border Control Corps, the Emperor Dong's palace. The love between men and women seemed to be getting farther and farther away from her, and she did not have the mood to touch it at all. She did not want to see Yang Shaoxiong again, but she saw him when she least wanted to see him. On the battlefield, the flying fairy was like a dream. His knife stabbed into her body without the slightest hesitation. Thousands of miles of yellow sand, the Taoist crazy demon, bathed in blood. Her knife plunged straight into his chest. Scenes from the past flashed through her mind with incomparable clarity. Bai Yuming raised her hand and wiped away her tears. Yang Shaoxiong's burly body began to become blurred. "Commander," she called him again. Yang Shaoxiong, whose eyes were calm and without any reluctance, replied, "Do you like me?" "Yes." "Oh." Yang Shaoxiong looked at the glow in the sky. The world in front of him began to darken and blur little by little. The desert was getting colder. Yang Shaoxiong tried to smile. "I'm leaving. Goodbye." They never saw each other again. The surging thunder and lightning slowly died out. Yang Shaoxiong's body turned into flying ashes under the fierce saber radiance. Bai Yuming stood in place. Her eyes were red and swollen, but her pupils were calm without any emotion. Countless soldiers of the Volcano Legion stopped. Their expressions were somewhat sad and incomparably angry, but more than that, they were at a loss. Was this a troop where discipline was more important than anything else? Maybe it was. At least for now, the existence of Yang Shaoxiong was more important than discipline. The wind and sand disappeared with the last ray of light of the thunder and lightning. The entire Volcano Corps lost its soul. "Are you okay?" Lin Yoxian's figure appeared beside Bai Yuming. "I'm okay," Bai Yuming said quietly. "But you look like you don't look good." Lin Yuxian smiled bitterly. He didn't quite understand the style of Taoist madness of Azura Path, but it could raise the combat capability of a half-step invincible realm expert to a higher level, so it was impossible that it didn't pay a price. In that monstrous blood wave, Bai Yuming could be said to have torn apart the strongest defense line of the Volcano Corps. She killed the old commander who had trained her personally and even loved her. "How about you be okay? I'm in a bad mood." Bai Yuming held the knife in her hand and said in a low voice. Lin Yuxian opened his mouth. "Someone must be responsible for everything that happened today." Bai Yuming raised her head. She looked in the direction of the desert prison ahead. She was surrounded by a dense crowd. Bang! A gunshot suddenly broke the silence on the battlefield. Deep in the crowd, an officer of the Volcano Corps raised his gun, pointed at Bai Yuming, and shot wildly. His eyes were red, and he was hysterical. Execute the order. Avenge the commander. Execute the order. Yang Xiaoxiong's last order. It was to let everyone in the Volcano Corps die here. Kill. Countless officers rushed over with red eyes at the same time. The officers led the soldiers and rushed over in a more crazy and fierce manner than before. I can die, Bai Yuming said quietly. She raised her hand. The knife in her hand shot to Fairy Tail. Fairy Tail took the knife. The next moment, Yang Xiaoxiong's knife fell into Bai Yuming's hand. The blade was raised, and the blade gleamed with scarlet blood in the sun. It was also Yang Xiaoxiong's blood. It was also Bai Yuming's blood. But can you kill me? Her slender figure took a step forward. The soaring blood suddenly sprinkled into the crowd like a bloody rain. Boom! An earth-shattering roar suddenly came from the distant rear of the Volcano Corps. Bai Yuming rushed into the crowd, and scrupulous and desperate. Lin Yuxian suddenly raised his head. In everyone's sight, the sky behind the Volcano Corps had completely turned into a fiery red. It was as if the entire sky was ablaze with unparalleled madness. That was artillery fire. Endless artillery fire occupied the whole sky. At this moment, the Tiger Armored Corps, which had been assisting the Volcano Corps, seemed to suddenly put down all the scruples. Countless artillery fire poured over unscrupulously. On the battlefield, the sky was burning, the corpses were scattered, and the blood was solidified. The scenes were like the end of the world. In the command room of the Tiger Armored Corps, Gu Qianxuan, who had rushed back from the front line with a murderous weapon, said coldly, "Continue to fire. I will be responsible for any consequences." Chapter 868. There was no doubt that as one of the trump cards of Beijiang, the ferocious Tiger Armored Corps had the highest firepower and destructive power in the entire Beijiang. The Beijiang military region was not at the level of the Zhongzhou theater of operations, but it was located on the border. It had always been the most sensitive province in the entire territory of Zhongzhou state. Ethnic issues, foreign threats, terrorists, all the hidden factors of unrest existed here. The ferocious Tiger Armored Corps in Beijiang was the main force to deter all kinds of disharmonious factors. Therefore, the ferocious Tiger Armored Corps was not only the trump card of Beijiang. In the entire Zhongzhou state, it could be regarded as one of the top heavy firepower legions. The Nightmare Legion was charging. The formation of the Volcano Legion began to collapse at a speed visible to the naked eye. Without Yang Xiaoxiong, the Volcano Legion seemed to have lost its soul. Some of the middle and high-level officers were still fighting with red eyes, but Bai Yuming, who was in a state of madness, had the kind of momentum that could kill anyone who stood in her way. The crazy and barbaric spirit of a Juropath of martial arts was displayed vividly in her, a disciple of Jade Pool. The perfect cooperation between Li Beitian and Lin Yuxian drove the entire Nightmare Legion forward. The middle and high-level officers were killed one by one. The orders of the Volcano Legion became more and more scattered, and the soldiers gradually became sober from the initial madness. They felt fear and shadow, and their attack became slower and slower. The Nightmare Legion, which had less than 1,000 people, forced the entire Volcano Legion to retreat. The Volcano Legion could not hold on any longer. Everyone could see the current situation clearly. 10 minutes. 15 minutes. In half an hour at most, the entire Volcano Legion would completely collapse, and the ferocious Tiger Armored Corps would be exposed in front of them. Lin Dongza, the commander of the ferocious Tiger Armored Corps, had been using the long-range precision strike weapon system to assist the Volcano Legion. He did not care about the casualties of the Volcano Legion, as Yang Xiaoxiong had said. The Volcano Legion and the ferocious Tiger Armored Corps fought together, but the distance between the two bases was the furthest among the several lines of defense, nearly 20 kilometers. Once the Volcano Legion was defeated, the Nightmare Legion had to run for nearly 20 kilometers to get close to the position of the ferocious Tiger Armored Corps. A road of 20 kilometers covered by endless artillery fire would be a real road of death for the Nightmare Legion. According to Lin Dong's estimation, there would be no more than 200 people who could actually reach his position. By then, the entire Nightmare Legion would have suffered a loss of nearly 10%, and the 43rd Division could completely annihilate the remaining Nightmare Legion. However, when the Volcano Corps was just defeated, Gu Qianquan led several experts of Kunlun City and the elites of the 43rd Army to the command room of the Fierce Tiger Armored Corps. The command was taken away in an instant. Gu Qianquan looked at the scene of the Volcano Legion's continuous defeat and cursed them for being useless. Then, he ordered the Fierce Tiger Legion to fire with all their might. Countless cannons roared and occupied every corner of the sky. The ferocious Tiger Army was aiming at the battlefield. It was not the Nightmare Legion or the Volcano Legion, but the entire battlefield. Everyone on the battlefield was shrouded in artillery fire. The crazy explosion almost set off the entire desert. This was no longer a battle. Facing the indifferent and merciless cannonballs, the Nightmare Army, the group suffered the most complete destruction. Retreat. Seeing this scene in the crowd, Lin Yoxian's expression changed dramatically. He suddenly moved forward and pulled back by Yu Ming, who was crazily killing in the crowd. The dragon-shaped sword energy beside him roared in the face of the distant artillery fire. All the experts above the peak of the fire-flaming realm in Emperor Dong's palace attacked with all their might at the same time. Raging fire and thunderbolts broke out in the formation of the Nightmare Legion. They merged with each other and turned into a shield shining with thunder and fire at a speed visible to the naked eye. The shield flickered and shook. In the center of the crowd, Lin Yoxian's face was grim and cold. He shouted, "Full speed charge!" The Nightmare Legion had already thought about what to do in the face of this moment. The only way was to charge at full speed. The Yellow Sand Corps, the Wilderness Brigade. Up to now, the Volcano Legion had broken 4 lines of defense in a row. This was a war between people. In the end, they faced the 43rd Army, Gu Qianquan, and even the murderous weapon. In the end, it was also a confrontation between people. But the Fierce Tiger Legion was special. The super long blank distance was a confrontation between martial arts and modern heavy firepower. This was the point in their plan where they would suffer the most losses. 1,000 people fought against the firepower of a heavily armored legion. Yes, in their expectation, 1,000 people fought against a legion. But no one expected that the Volcano Legion would be so tricky. Their losses exceeded expectations. The situation they faced was also unexpected. The madness of the Beijiang military region seemed to be fully revealed. Before the Volcano Legion was completely defeated, the Fierce Tiger Armored Legion had already opened fire. What did this mean? The most direct point. When a large number of soldiers of the Volcano Legion hesitated between advancing and retreating, they stood in front of the Nightmare Legion. They would be destroyed by heavy firepower. But at the same time, it greatly slowed down the speed of the Nightmare Legion. This kind of charge was not a charge without obstacles within a certain distance. Every single soldier of the Volcano Legion had become an obstacle. They would resist and even attack their obstacles. Lin Yuxian felt cold all over. The artillery fire covered the sky and set off the desert. The Nightmare Legion moved forward recklessly in the crowd. The pseudo-domain condensed by countless experts turned into a shield that was constantly shining. The first batch of artillery fire smashed down fiercely. One after another, it was like a rainstorm. No one could tell what kind of weapon was in front of them. Everyone's sight was full of fire. Artillery shells. Dense artillery shells were like hailstones. From a long distance, they could even see the thick smoke rising in the direction of the Fierce Tiger Armored Legion. Countless artillery fire covered the pseudo-domain of the Nightmare Legion in an instant. The shield formed by the pseudo-domain flashed for a moment. However, it only took 3 to 5 seconds. The positive shield suddenly broke under the artillery fire all over the sky. An endless stream of artillery shells smashed into the formation of the Nightmare Legion. Disperse. Keep a safe distance and charge. Lin Yoxian's voice seemed to be blurred in the artillery fire. He gritted his teeth and stared ahead. Don't look back. Don't look back. Everyone was charging. If they didn't look back, it meant that they were doomed to sacrifice a group of comrades who were injured in the artillery fire but would not die for the time being. Lin Yuxian held the long sword in his hand tightly. His always gentle and calm face was completely distorted, and his eyes were blood red. Kill! Kill them! The bright and dazzling sword light gathered wildly on him. A large number of artillery shells kept exploding around him. The broken flesh, the splashing blood, and the permeating yellow sand covered his body layer by layer. In front of him was still the Volcano Legion with a desperate look. Lin Yoxian's blood-red eyes suddenly became calm. On the battlefield full of flames and smoke, a shining and incredible sword light suddenly appeared. The sword light kept blooming in the crowd with a lot of blood. A terrifying aura rose to the sky with the sword energy. The peak of the thunder-shocking realm. The limit of the thunder-shocking realm. Half-step invincible realm. The dazzling sword light went straight forward in the crowd, as if it could tear everything in the world. The 21st blade. The shattering of land. Lin Yoxian's whole body seemed to have become a sword light. The sword light kept extending higher and higher. The sword energy was mighty, like a torrent running across the world. The artillery fire kept smashing down from the sky in the distance. The Volcano Legion on the ground was crowded together. The sword light flew through the artillery fire and the crowd, moving forward with the style that had shown in the dark world for hundreds of years. Fierce explosions and screams were mixed together. The sword light almost rushed over 100 meters in an instant. All the artillery shells along the way were touched by the sword light, burning and exploding in the air. The Volcano Legion on the ground seemed to be torn apart by a sword. The Nightmare Legion stepped on the passage opened by the shattering of land and moved forward without hesitation. 200 meters. The shining sword light flew all the way to a distance of nearly 200 meters before it slowly stopped. The first wave of artillery fire of the ferocious tiger-armored corps finally passed. The Volcano Legion seemed to have completely come to their senses. A large number of soldiers, who had been scared out of their wits, screamed and began to flee. The Nightmare Legion sped up again and kept moving forward. Lin Yoxian's figure stopped in the sky, holding a long sword. He looked in the direction of the ferocious tiger army and narrowed his eyes. In a desperate situation, he went from the peak of the thunder-shocking realm to the half-step invincible realm in one fell swoop. His aura was still rising, but at a certain moment it fell back madly. In the headquarters of the ferocious tiger-armored corps, Gu Qianchuan almost witnessed the whole scene. His pupils contracted slightly. He stared at Lin Yoxian's figure in the air and was silent for a long time. The second wave of artillery fire flew out with a roar. Gu Qianchuan stared at the Nightmare Legion. He twitched the corner of his mouth and said in a hoarse voice, "Contact General Huang of the Beijiang Corps and ask for fighter jets. I want to see how far they can go." Chapter 869. As the Supreme Commander of the Beijiang Army, Huang Tong did not leave his office all day. The sky outside the window was clear, but the wind and clouds were changing. Almost every moment, Huang Tong could clearly perceive the huge pressure that was enough to completely crush him. Not long ago, he received a call from the Vice Minister of the Cabinet, Hua Jingyang. Shortly after he hung up, Li Huaqing called, and then by Qing Zhao, the Deputy Secretary General of the Army Headquarters, called on behalf of Dong Qingwudi. Everyone's words seemed to convey the same meaning. Emperor Dong's palace could lose. But the important figures, especially Lin Yuxian, could not die. The pressure on Huang Tong continued to increase. Not only Lin Yuxian could not die. If Lin Yuxian died, the Lin clan would not let him go. Except for Lin Yuxian, if Li Beitian died, Wei Kunlun would not be polite to him. Bai Yuming was the eldest daughter of the current generation of the Bai family. If she had an accident, by Zhan Fong, by Qing Zhao, by Qing Xin, Dong Changwudi, everyone would not give him a good result. The huge pressure almost suffocated Huang Tong. For the first time, he found himself standing in the center of the war. Countless people were paying attention. The eyes were cold and warning, as if to say that no matter what the result of the war was, he would not have good end. Huang Tong had no choice. Born the prince group, he could violate the parliament and the Lin clan, but he could not disobey Chun Fangqing's orders. His only choice now was to hold on to Chun Fangqing, the life-saving straw, do things 100% according to Chun Fangqing's will, and then wait for the result of the war. He sat in his office, staring at the huge screen in front of him. The screen was connected to the satellite of the Beijiang military region. The picture on the battlefield was transmitted immediately. He could see every change in the battle situation. Li Baiyan's Supreme Taishu, Bai Yoming's Heavenly Fairy, Taoist lunatic on the battlefield of the volcano core, Lin Yuxian, who broke through to the half-step invincible realm in a desperate situation, performed the shatter of land. Huang Tong's expression became more and more complicated. The artillery fire that filled the sky poured in the direction of the Nightmare Corps without reservation. The elites of the Nightmare Corps were decreasing at a speed visible to the naked eye. The screen shook violently. Sitting in the office, Huang Tong could clearly feel the intensity of the battle on the battlefield. His eyes were red, but they gradually calmed down. Chun Fangqing's words kept echoing in his mind. This is war. Lin Yuxian couldn't die. Li Beijian couldn't die. Bai Yuming couldn't die. These were all compromises, all so-called leeway. But there would be no compromise in war, and there would be no leeway. This was a game of life and death. Within a week, I will kill your entire family. Lin Yuxian's threat not long ago reappeared in his mind. Huang Tong's eyes flashed with fear and dread, which eventually turned into madness and delight. F*CKU, he muttered to himself, "Go to hell, all of you go to hell." The phone suddenly rang. His body trembled subconsciously, and he looked back at the red, encrypted phone on the table. What he was most afraid of was answering the phone. The war had reached its most critical moment. The life and death of the Nightmare Legion could be decided in the next second. He didn't even dare to think about who was behind the phone. Li Huacheng, Hua Zhengyang, Dong Chengwudi were all possible. He hesitated, stood up slowly, picked up the phone slowly, and said in a deep voice, "I'm Huang Tong. General Huang, I'm Gu Qianchuan." On the phone, Gu Qianchuan's calm but somewhat cold voice sounded. Huang Tong was slightly relieved. Although the Prince Group and the Special Warfare Group had drifted apart in recent years, at least in this matter, Gu Qianchuan stood with the Prince Group. "Your Highness, hello." Huang Tong forced a smile. "I'm at the headquarters of the ferocious Tiger Armored Legion. Have you seen the battle situation?" Gu Qianchuan asked. "Yes, I'm watching." The firepower of the ferocious Tiger Armored Legion does not disappoint. Countless thoughts flashed in Huang Tong's mind, but he was somewhat relieved. He knew very well what kind of person Lin Dong, the commander of the ferocious Tiger Armored Legion, was. This person's ability was undoubtedly extremely strong, but his character was very calm. When the Volcano Legion had not completely collapsed, he could not let the Armored Legion fire with all their strength. This was completely pushing the Volcano Legion and the Nightmare Legion to a dead end. He was so cruel. To put it bluntly, the ferocious Tiger Armored Legion fired at this time was a living fire. The soldiers of the Volcano Legion were regarded as lifeless cannon fodder or obstacles used to block the charge of the Nightmare Legion. Such intensive firepower killed not only the enemy, but also the friendly forces. Lin Dong could not do such a thing, but Gu Qianchuan could. Gu Qianchuan faintly agreed on the phone and slowly said, "Lin Yuxian broke through in the last minute. His combat capability is very strong. The Volcano Legion's blocking effect is not great. With your Highness here, what can Lin Yuxian do?" Huang Tong licked his lips without thinking. Of course, he was telling the truth. No matter how amazing Lin Yuxian was, he had broken through to the half-step invincible realm. He had not reached the level of Li Tianlan more than 2 years ago. Not to mention Lin Yuxian. Even if Li Tianlan stood on the battlefield at this time, what could he do? Even if he had made progress in the past 2 years and entered the real invincible realm, he could not rely on his own strength to resist the huge firepower of a heavy armor legion. Even if he was lucky enough to survive, he could not be Gu Qianquan's opponent. Gu Qianquan had a murderous weapon in his hand. I really don't care about Lin Yuxian, but I don't like variables. I don't like any variables. General Huang, I am here with a murderous weapon. It is not used to deal with Lin Yuxian. Do you understand what I mean? Gu Qianquan's tone was calm and hoarse. Huang Tong was stunned and tentatively asked, Your Highness, what do you mean? I need support. Gu Qianquan said blandly, I am not here to deal with Lin Yuxian and the Nightmare Legion. I never have. The murderous weapon in my hand is used to guard against Li Tianlan. Although he has not appeared in the desert, no one can guarantee that he will not rush to the battlefield in the next moment. I need to maintain the peak state to completely suppress Li Tianlan, who may appear at any time. As for the Nightmare Legion, from the beginning, they have been the target of the Beijiang military region. That was the truth. The Beijiang military region had an army of more than 100,000 people. The Nightmare Legion had less than 2,000 people. The huge and incredible gap in a number was enough to completely make up for the lack of strength. Not to mention that only Lin Yuxian, Bai Yuming, and Li Beitian were leading the Nightmare Legion at this time. In the original plan, the Nightmare Legion envisioned by the Beijiang military region was definitely much more luxurious than the current lineup. That was the lineup of Saint Wei, Kunlun, and hidden god Situ, Sangyue. An army of more than 100,000 people and countless armaments and weapons could definitely stop a small legion of less than 2,000 people led by two invincible realm experts. Gu Qianquan and Setting Sun were their top combat forces. Naturally, this should be used to guard against the most powerful people in Emperor Dong's palace. Situ Sangyue and Wei Kunlun did not come. Gu Qianquan's shot was bound to fall on Li Tianlan. Huang Tong did not hesitate and could not hesitate. When he received the call from Chun Fangqing, he had no choice but to brace himself to launch a war. If he lost, he would definitely die. Only by winning could he have a chance of survival. Therefore, without any hesitation, he directly said, Your Highness, what kind of support do you want? I'll arrange it right away. As long as he could win, he would do anything. It was good to win. Transfer the Air Force. Gu Qianquan said blandly, The armed helicopters are of little significance to the experts at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. The armored vehicles and main battle tanks of the Fierce Tiger Armored Corps have no advantage after the distance is shortened. You know what I mean? Huang Tong froze for a moment. As a heavy corps, the Fierce Tiger Armored Corps was equipped with armed helicopters inside. However, helicopters were of little significance to the experts above the thunder-shocking realm. Low-altitude flight risked being killed at any time. High-altitude flight was of little significance to martial arts experts, not to mention the main battle tanks. Just now, Lin Yoshin's Shatter of Land could open a passage of more than 200 meters in the chaotic crowd in a flash. This was enough to show that the sword could also split any alloy armor. But the Air Force, he hesitated and said softly, the Air Force Command. The Beijiang military region also had an Air Force, but the most sophisticated Air Force was under the dual management of the Zhongzhou State Air Force and the Beijiang military region. The current commander of the Zhongzhou State Air Force Command had been born in the Border Control Corps many years ago. It could be said that he was the first senior officer of the Border Control Corps. In other words, he was a direct subordinate of Dong Chengwudi. No need for the top troops. Send the Great Ambition team. Gu Qianquan's voice was resolute. This was the Air Force that the Beijiang military region could fully control. Although the level of the fighter could not be regarded as the world's top level, it was also the world's first class. It was fast, flexible, and powerful enough for the task at hand. Huang Tong narrowed his eyes and became calmer and calmer. Things had come to this and could not be reversed. He simply stopped thinking about it. His eyes were fixed on the screen in the office. On the screen, with the collapse of the volcano troop, the Nightmare troop no longer had any obstacles in front of them. Charge! Charge at full speed. In the open terrain, the artillery that occupied the sky kept roaring like crazy. They were getting faster and faster. People kept falling behind. The Nightmare troop did not stop at all. They kept moving forward like a flash of lightning in the state of constant blood loss and loss of members. Huang Tong looked at it expressionlessly. After a long time, he slowly said, "I'll arrange it right away." Gu Qianchuan nodded with satisfaction and hung up the phone. Huang Tong put down the microphone and took a deep look at the screen again. He knew the firepower of the ferocious tiger armored corps very well. Gu Qianchuan's cruel and ruthless order now seemed to be the right decision. The time when the volcano troop was used as an obstacle was not long, but it caused unimaginable damage to the nightmare troop. If the Great Ambition team was sent, Huang Tong laughed. No matter how lucky the nightmare troop was under the bombardment of the Great Ambition team, even if they finally got close to the ferocious tiger armored troop, they would have at most dozens of people. If there was no accident, the entire Nightmare Troop would be annihilated in the attack of the Great Ambition team. Nightmare Troop? Emperor Dong's palace? It was all over. Huang Tong's smile was a little crazy. He grabbed the phone, quickly dialed a number, and said in a deep voice, "Set off immediately to support the ferocious tiger armored troop." The other side of the phone paused for a second, and then a sonorous voice sounded, "Yes." Huang Tong put down the phone, sat in the office chair again, and poured himself a cup of tea. He thought carefully, grabbed the phone again, and began to dial. The phone was quickly connected. A very old, tired, yet excited voice rang out. "I am Chen Fanqing, Prime Minister." Huang Tong subconsciously sat up straight. "Yes." Chen Fanqing nodded. The faint sound of gunfire kept ringing from the phone, but it was a little distorted. Huang Tong was stunned. And then he understood. At this moment, Chen Fanqing was also watching the battle in the desert. At this moment, many bigwigs in Zhongzhou State were paying close attention to everything in the desert. "Huang Tong, the Beijiang military region is doing a good job," Chen Fanqing said slowly. "The ferocious tiger armored troop has strong firepower. Not long ago, His Highness Gu Qianchuan issued the right order. The volcano troop successfully delayed the nightmare troop. At present, everything seems to be going well." Huang Tong whispered. "Very good," Chen Fanqing said quietly. "What's the matter?" Huang Tong hesitated and said softly, "Prime Minister, His Highness Gu Qianchuan just contacted me and asked me to mobilize the Great Ambition team." "The Great Ambition team?" Chen Fanqing paused slightly and said slowly, "Is it necessary?" His Highness Gu Qianchuan said that Li Tianlan will appear at any time. He wants to maintain the peak state to face Li Tianlan. I think he wants to completely bury the nightmare troop in the desert. He doesn't even want a nightmare troop to get close to the ferocious tiger armored troop. On the phone, Chen Fanqing was silent for a long time. Huang Tong waited quietly. After a long time, Chen Fanqing smiled and hung up the phone. He didn't say anything. But saying nothing was sometimes a kind of attitude. For Huang Tong, it was the greatest support. Huang Tong clenched his fists and took a deep breath. The moment the phone was hung up, he really felt Chen Fanqing's killing intent. The killing intent was so determined. Before the war began, he was sure that all of Chen Fanqing's killing intent was concentrated on the Wang family of Beihai. His attitude toward Emperor Dong's palace was relatively vague. Did his attitude change? Or he thought of the scenes when the nightmare troop rampaged in the desert. The flying blood and messy corpses fully showed that Emperor Dong's palace did not take Chen Fanqing and the Beijiang military region seriously. So, Emperor Dong's palace brought about its own destruction. The roar shook the sky. Huang Tong opened the window. The sunshine outside the window was gorgeous and warm. The sun was setting. In the dreamy sunset glow, one fighter jet after another quickly took off and rushed in the direction of the desert. At the same time, in another direction, Lin Fengting, expressionless but somewhat anxious, kept moving forward alone. Less than 100 meters in front of him was already a stretch of yellow sand. The meteor shone in the sky. The unparalleled sword light kept flashing in the sunset glow. It entered Longjiang from Beihai, went straight to the plateau, and rushed into Suzhou. The sunset glow was dazzling. At the same time, the Great Ambition team took off. A 10,000-meter-long arc of light flashed at the junction of Suzhou and Beijiang. Daytime meteor. The meteor kept moving forward and officially entered Beijiang. Chapter 870. For Zhongzhou State, today was destined to be the beginning of a series of upheavals. The battle in the desert had been going on. It was no exaggeration to say that the outcome of the Desert War could directly determine the pattern of Zhongzhou State for a long time to come. All members of the Parliament of Zhongzhou State were allowed to watch the war directly. The encrypted signal of a satellite was connected to the designated equipment of each member. Li Huacheng, Hua Zhenyang, and Chun Fangqing watched again. Dong Qingwudi was also watching. Everyone saw the sharpness of the Nightmare Army, which broke through the 4 lines of defense in the desert. They saw the constant loss of the Nightmare Army. They saw a large number of soldiers of Zhongzhou State stain the desert with blood and buried in the yellow sand. They also saw the overwhelming artillery fire of the fierce Tiger Armored Corps. What is Beijiang doing? Do they have any respect for the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State? These people, from top to bottom, are unqualified. They should all be dismissed and punished severely. In the building of the army headquarters, in Dong Qingwudi's office, Bai Qingzhao almost pounded the table to vent his emotions. They all have to pay the price. They must pay the price. The artillery fire roared wildly on the screen, almost deafening. Bai Qingzhao clenched his fists and stared at the screen in front of him. His daughter was in the Nightmare Army, and she was at the forefront. What do you say now? Bai Qingzhao suddenly raised his head and looked at Dong Qingwudi. Dong Qingwudi's expression was a little gloomy. He shook his head and did not speak. He was indeed the standing minister of the army headquarters. But don't forget who his predecessor was. The former tycoon of the army headquarters, Qi Beizong. Even though he had retired for several years, his influence was still there. The team he built was still a powerful force in the army headquarters to balance Dong Qingwudi. Qi Beizong was the leader of the Special Warfare Group and the main bridge of communication between the Special Warfare Group and the Prince Group. When he was in office, he was extremely strict with Beijiang. Most of the people in the military and the government in Beijiang were from the Prince Group, and a few were from the Special Warfare Group. Now Gu Xingyun and Chun Fangqing joined hands. Even Dong Qingwudi could hardly intervene in everything in Beijiang. Let's talk to the president. Bai Qingzhao took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and said, I heard that the president's attitude has changed. It's inevitable that he'll change his attitude, but that's only towards Chun Fangqing, not us. Dong Qingwudi looked at the screen in front of him, shook his head, and said, the outcome hasn't been decided yet. He changed his attitude just to leave room for compromise. If Chun Fangqing loses, he can still clean up the mess. If Chun Fangqing wins, there's no need to say anything. It's unrealistic for the president to make his attitude clear now. Then what should we do? Bai Qingzhao suddenly stood up. Yu Ming is in the desert now. I saw her just now. She's on the screen. She's not in a good state. I'm fine. Dong Qingwudi shook his head. The Nightmare Corps may be defeated, but how can a half-step invincible realm expert die so easily? Don't worry too much. The shrill ringtone of the phone suddenly rang. Dong Qingwudi narrowed his eyes, picked up the phone, and said hello. General, I'm Donglai. A dull, hard voice rang out from the other end of the line. Donglai, the general of Zhongzhou State, one of the directors of Zhongzhou State Army Headquarters, and the commander of Zhongzhou State Air Force Command. He was the first batch of senior officers of the Border Control Corps and the first batch of senior officers to leave the Border Control Corps. He was the backbone of the giant group and could be said to be the direct descendant of Dong Qingwudi. Dong Qingwudi's gloomy face eased for a moment, and he asked, What's the matter? I've received a report from the Beijiang military region. The ambition team has moved. Donglai's voice was serious and awe-inspiring. Crack! A shocking crack suddenly appeared on the luxurious desk under Dong Qingwudi's hand. The ambition team also belonged to the Zhongzhou State Air Force and was under the dual management of the Zhongzhou State Air Force and the Beijiang military region. They were not the top air fighter formation in Zhongzhou State, so the Beijing military region had a lot of control over them, and the Air Force Command had a lot of guidance over them. The strongest air team in Beijing today was codenamed Wild Eagle. It was the most sophisticated air force in Beijing and was equipped with the most sophisticated fighters in Zhongzhou State. Although they also belonged to the Beijing military region, most of the time they received orders from the Air Force Command, and the Beijing military region only had the right to guide them. Now Beijing bypassed the Wild Eagle team and mobilized the Ambition team. It was obvious that they were going to bypass the Air Force Command. To put it more seriously, they were going to bypass the Army headquarters in Dongqing Wudi. Dongqing Wudi asked by Qin Zhao to call Huang Tong not long ago. What did that mean? General, we can't hesitate, or the consequences will be unpredictable. I can directly intervene in the desert war here. Emperor Dong's palace needs support. I can give it to them, He Donglai said in a deep voice. Dongqing Wudi was silent for a long time. He Donglai's voice also reached Bai Qingzhao's ears. Bai Qingzhao heard that Beijing mobilized the Ambition team. It was obvious that they wanted to kill everyone in Emperor Dong's palace. He was anxious and angry, but when he heard He Donglai's words, he also fell silent. Sitting in He Donglai's position, he did have the power, ability, and strength to intervene in the desert war. He was the supreme commander of all the air forces in Zhongzhou State. But why he could intervene and why he intervened were two different things. At least for now. The war in the desert was still the suppression of Emperor Dong's palace and the Wang family of Beihai by the will of Zhongzhou State. Beijing carried out the will of Zhongzhou State. Under such circumstances, what did it mean for He Donglai, the Zhongzhou Air Force commander, to intervene to support Emperor Dong's palace? It was almost equivalent to destroying his own future, and it also meant that the situation had escalated. As soon as He Donglai took action, it was no longer a war between the parliament and Emperor Dong's palace. It was equivalent to a civil war. He Donglai was not only Dongqing Wudi's subordinate, but also his brother who had followed him for many years. It was not an exaggeration to say that they were as close as brothers. Dongqing Wudi did not want He Donglai to bear the most likely serious consequences at all. Secretary General Bai is also here, right? He Donglai suddenly smiled. When I went to visit Senior Bai a few years ago, Yu Ming was still young. That girl called me godfather. Donglai. Bai Qingzhao gave a wry smile. If anything goes wrong, I'll take responsibility. At worst, I'll go to the desert prison for a few years, but it won't be long. When your highness is really invincible, I can go wherever I want, right? He Donglai smiled. That's it. The phone was hung up immediately. Dongqing Wudi's body shook. He held the phone and was silent for a long time. Bai Qingzhao was in a daze. He looked at Dongqing Wudi and whispered, Donglai, it's okay. Dongqing Wudi said blandly, this is actually the situation I want to see the most. Bai Qingzhao was a little confused. Donglai may suffer some grievances, but it's not hopeless. He knows this himself. He puts all his hopes on Tianlan. As he said, the consequences of his intervention this time may be serious, but I'm not dead. I can't really see him lose his life. As long as he lives, he will stay in the desert prison for a few years at most. When Tianlan is invincible in the world, Donglai will be able to come out. Dongqing Wudi said quietly. He really hoped to see such a situation. The giant group was very big. In the past 2 years, the Academy and the Prince Group had taken a lot of resources and position from the giant group. The giant group had tried its best to reshuffle. But even so, the giant group was still very big. He was now the leader of the giant group. Everyone also regarded him as the leader of the giant group. But how many people would regard Li Tianlan as the future of the giant group? Dongqing Wudi himself was not very clear about this. He Donglai was the first one. At least he was the first one to express such an attitude. He looked up at the screen in front of him. There was no battle on the screen, but the confrontation between martial arts and modern heavy firepower was breaking out every moment. Artillery fire that covered the sky and covered the earth almost enveloped everything. The screen was full of flying yellow sand. The formation of the Nightmare Troop gathered together and kept accelerating forward. The yellow sand and artillery fire shrouded their figures, appearing and disappearing from time to time. Almost every time they appeared, their number would decrease. Dongsheng Wudi stared at this scene and muttered to himself, "Someone must pay the price for this. Someone must pay the price." The phone rang again. Dongsheng Wudi looked down at the caller ID and raised his eyebrows slightly. He never thought that he would receive a call from the Prime Minister's office at this time. The phone kept ringing. Dongsheng Wudi raised his hand and pressed the hang-up button. His body was motionless, and his face was expressionless. He didn't know what Chen Fangqing wanted to say to him, and he didn't want to know. By now, the end of this game had already become clear. Fight to the death. There was only one result. The screen was shaking slowly. The satellite picture switched for a moment. The overwhelming artillery fire seemed to have gone away. The next moment, a densely packed steel army appeared on the screen. One after another, main battle tanks and armored vehicles rushed out of the base of the fierce Tiger Armored Corps. Without the slightest pause, they rushed directly in the direction of the Nightmare Troop. The steel torrent roared forward, full of murderous intent. At the same time, in the Air Force Command of Zhengzhou State, a Major General Staff officer stood in front of He Donglai and frowned. "Commander, we can't get in touch with the Wild Eagle Troop at present. It seems that the Beijing military region unilaterally cut off our communication signal." He Donglai suddenly raised his head, but the face of Huang Tong of the Beijing military region appeared in his mind. He cut off the communication signal, which meant that the Air Force Command couldn't get in touch with the Wild Eagle Troop at all. Had they taken precautions? He Donglai took a deep breath. Without the slightest hesitation, he said directly, "Contact the Sky Pillar Troop immediately. Let them take off immediately, go to the desert, and support Emperor Dong's palace." The Major General Staff officer was stunned. He repeated the order and said softly, "Are you sure? This is an order." He Donglai's voice was cold. The Sky Pillar Troop was the top fighter formation in Suzhou. Letting them take off from Suzhou and cross provinces into Beijing was undoubtedly more serious. "And the time? Can we make it?" The Major General said softly. "The performance of the Ambition Troops fighter is a little worse. The Sky Pillar Troops fighter is faster. If they take off now, they can enter the battlefield in about 15 minutes. They can hold on." He Donglai shook his head and said calmly, "Go send the order." The Major General took a deep look at him, nodded, and turned to go out. Chapter 871. In the open battlefield, where there was a distance, the real invincible was never and could not be human. Manpower was sometimes limited. However, the most ferocious firepower seemed to never stop. The Volcano Legion had completely collapsed. There were no obstacles in front of the Nightmare Legion. It could be said that they had really set foot on the road of death. They sprinted at full speed. Speed. The only thing the Nightmare Legion needed in such a situation was speed. Speed was very meaningful, because the faster they were, the earlier they could rush into the base of the fierce Tiger Armored Legion. But speed was also meaningless, because the distance between the two sides was too far. They could not cross a distance of nearly 20 kilometers in an instant. Such a long-distance charge was enough to make people desperate. The overwhelming artillery fire had completely turned the desert upside down. There were explosions everywhere. The burning flames and thick smoke almost covered everything. The powerful impact of the explosion was constantly surging in every inch of yellow sand around them. The masters of the Nightmare Legion tried their best to form layers of pseudo-domains. But the pseudo-domains, which were enough to withstand most weapons, were completely like bubbles in the dense and unimaginable artillery fire. Their physical strength was consumed quickly. There were no enemies in front of the Nightmare Legion. There were only yellow sand, only shells flying from a distance and then exploding around them. This journey was so boring and desperate. Everyone, including Lin Yuxian, had a sense of powerlessness. He used to be the heir of the Lin clan. The headquarters of the Lin clan stood aloof from worldly affairs, like a paradise. But the patriarchs of the Lin clan were not relaxed. From childhood to adulthood, Lin Yuxian had received the most rigorous and even cruel training. He did not have a unique physique like the heavenly king's heart of wind and thunder veins, but his talent could also be said to be top-notch. Top-notch talent and top-notch inheritance. His series of conditions were not inferior to anyone else. He had also experienced so-called difficulties and even desperate situations, but he had never been as powerless as today. When he was at his strongest, he faced the concentrated fire of the entire heavy armor legion. The surging sword light whistled in the air. A large number of shells were smashed in the condensed sword light. The strong impact was constantly surging in all directions. He rushed to the forefront of everyone, charging and waving his sword. There was endless yellow sand in front of him. He did not even see the base of the fierce tiger-armored legion. Lin Yuxian did not know how far he had rushed. Maybe 1 kilometer, maybe 10 kilometers. Everyone's line of sight was filled with cannonballs. It was as if the cannonballs would never stop raining down from afar, filling everyone's senses. The willpower of the Nightmare Army began to waver and become numb. In their muddle-headedness, they did not even know whether they were moving faster or slower. Wang Yi, a hoarse roar suddenly rang out, instantly suppressing the sounds of the surrounding explosions. Lin Yuxian, who was in a trance, was shocked and turned his head subconsciously. Fairy Tail frantically tried to run in another direction, but the elites of the Nightmare Legion pulled him back. The deafening explosion raised a large amount of smoke and sand. Lin Yuxian could not see what happened in that direction, but he remembered Wang Yi. He was one of the most promising candidates in a Nightmare Army to break through to the thunder-shocking realm this year. He was Fairy Tail's cousin. When they were in the Deep Sea Academy, the two of them formed a team. Later, even though the team was broken up, the two of them had been watching over each other. But now, Wang Yi died here. Lin Yuxian, it was clear that this was just the beginning. The pseudo-domain supported by the Nightmare Legion was vulnerable in the bombardment, but it could block the fiercest attack of the enemy in an instant. This pseudo-domain was formed by the joint efforts of all the experts of the thunder-shocking realm and the peak of the fire-flaming realm in the Nightmare Legion. The pseudo-domain was constantly formed and then constantly shattered. This process consumed a lot of physical strength of each participant. The experts of the thunder-shocking realm could still hold on, but the experts at the peak of the fire-flaming realm were beginning to fail. Their current situation was even more dangerous than some experts of the ice-condensing realm in the Nightmare Legion. The ice-condensing realm only needed to charge, but they had to overdraft their physical strength to supplement the constantly shattered domain. Wang Yi was the first. Who would be the second? When the experts at the peak of the fire-flaming realm were constantly sacrificed and fell, the domain of the thunder-shocking realm was bound to be weaker. At that time, the ones who would fall would be the ordinary experts of the fire-flaming realm and the peak of the ice-condensing realm. Then the thunder-shocking realm. The peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Half-step invincible realm. Lin Yuxian looked at the boundless yellow sand ahead. When they rushed to the Tiger-Armored Legion, how many people would be left? And don't forget, behind the Tiger-Armored Legion, there was the full 43rd Army, the trump card of Beijiang. There was also Gu Qianchuan and the murderous weapon, Setting Sunday. Lin Yuxian gritted his teeth. He did not regret it. At this point, in any case, he only knew one thing. No matter what, they could not retreat. The number of the entire Nightmare Legion was getting smaller and smaller. They roared like a beast, constantly losing blood in a desperate situation, and rushed straight in the direction of the Tiger-Armored Legion. They can't hold on any longer. In the command room of the Tiger-Armored Legion, Commander Lin Dongzi saw this scene, and his tone was a little complicated. Victory was close at hand, and there was no suspense. But for some reason, he was not excited at all. It was a very strange feeling. He saw the Volcano Legion being slaughtered crazily, saw his longtime friend Yang Xiaoxiong fall down, and saw the Nightmare Legion losing blood crazily. Victory and failure were all in it. But he was not angry, excited, or happy. There was only a kind of indescribable sadness and bewilderment. Even now, he still couldn't understand why things had turned out this way, and what was the meaning of all this. He glanced at Gu Qianchuan. Gu Qianchuan was staring at the screen. His eyes were bright, and he was full of interest. As expected, it is the trump card of the Heavy Armor Legion of the Beijiang military region. Its firepower is really powerful. He turned to look at Lin Dongzi and said approvingly. Lin Dongzi forced a smile and did not speak. How long will it take for the main battle tanks to arrive? Gu Qianchuan suddenly asked. Lin Dongzi thought for a moment and operated on the screen in front of him. The picture was switched to the desert topographic map. He looked at it and said, "It will take about 8 minutes." Well, 8 minutes, Gu Qianchuan nodded. Is it about the same time for the Ambition team? It was not close to the center of Beijiang. With the speed of the Ambition team, the fighters should arrive earlier than the main battle tanks, but not too early. At most, there would be a difference of about 1 minute. Artillery fire was still being fired in the base. And at most 8 minutes, the Nightmare Legion, which was left with only a few hundred people, would be besieged by hundreds of main battle tanks and armored vehicles. Above them, there was still a full complement of 12 fighter jets bombing nonstop. Gu Qianchuan's smile became more obvious. Looking at the diminishing number of Nightmare Legion on the screen, he muttered to himself, "How are you going to survive? Pass down my order. All main battle tanks and armored vehicles are to split up and advance at full speed. I need the most powerful firepower." He stood up and left the command room. "Where is your highness going?" Lin Dong followed him subconsciously. Gu Qianchuan paused for a moment and turned to look at Lin Dongzi. His smile was a little weird. Li Tianla may not come. As for the Nightmare Legion, if they can survive the siege of main battle tanks and fighter jets, I will personally send them to hell. Lin Dong, on the other hand, opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Gu Qianchuan walked out of the command room and subconsciously reached out to touch the setting sun in his hand. Lin Fengting's figure was already far away from the edge of the desert. He kept adjusting his direction and accelerating. He could already see the ruins and corpses left behind by the Yellow Sand Army. He sprinted as fast as he could and had already reached the outermost defense line of the desert. As the strongest man in the Dark World today, he was indeed very fast. But no matter how fast he could not be faster than fighter jets. Even if Ambition's fighter jets were not the most advanced models, their speed was still beyond Lin Fengting's reach. As the sun set in the west, the dazzling rays dyed the entire desert a fiery red. Lin Fengting, who was marching, suddenly raised his head and looked at the sky. He watched helplessly as the 12 fighter jets spread out in formation and swooped over his head, directly cutting into the distant battlefield. Lin Fengting stood in place and was silent for a while. The distance of dozens of kilometers was not short for him, but for the fighter jets, it was instantaneous. He was the old patriarch of the Lin clan. The Lin clan stood aloof from worldly affairs. Strictly speaking, Lin Yuxian was just a branch of the Lin clan. Therefore, in the face of Lin Yuxian's situation, he had never said anything. It was the other branches of the Lin clan who spoke. But the fact that he could appear here already showed his attitude. Lin Fengting did not know if he could make it in time. But as he stood in this desert, he had already made up his mind. If something really happened to Lin Yuxian, he would go straight to Kunlun City with his sword no matter what and kill everyone in Kunlun City. Lin Yuxian's eyes were cold, and he continued to move forward. His body moved, and then he suddenly turned his head, looking behind him. There was only the setting sun and the glow in the sky behind. At an unknown distance, there seemed to be an unimaginable sharpness approaching at an unimaginable speed. Lin Fengting narrowed his eyes. A small black spot appeared in the farthest distance of his sight. Even with his power, he did not know whether the small black spot existed. It was too far away and looked like an illusion. But the next moment, the small black spot suddenly became clear. The sharpness tore the world in an instant. It was still far away. In Lin Fengting's line of sight, that pitch black that had transformed into an incomparably ostentatious arc of light. Lin Fengting suddenly opened his eyes wide. Gu Qianchuan's figure left the base of the fierce tiger armored corps. He held the setting sun in his hand. Without any warning, the setting sun in his hand suddenly trembled. It seemed to be excited and trembling. In Lin Fengting's sight above the desert, the meteor-like arc of light in the distance passed the city and rushed straight into the desert. At the same time, in the desert prison, sitting in the room, Li Tianlan, whose body had almost become a statue, suddenly opened his eyes. Chapter 872. Taking a step forward was hell. Taking a step back was also hell. 15 minutes after the defeat of the Volcano Legion, the Nightmare Legion finally saw the steel torrent of the fierce Tiger Armored Legion at the extreme distance. How powerful was the firepower of an ace-level heavy armor legion? Everyone in the Nightmare Legion felt that they had seen it before. They had seen the long-range firepower coverage of the heavy armor legion, but they had not seen the steel torrent of the heavy armor legion. The main battle tanks and armored vehicles were charging at the forefront in a majestic manner. All-terrain vehicles equipped with various super-heavy firepower followed slowly. Self-propelled artillery, howitzers, automatic missile systems, rocket launchers, and armed helicopters that kept rising in altitude. The mountains and plains were everywhere. Countless heavy firepower appeared in the desert. The artillery inside the base of the fierce Tiger Armored Legion was still roaring. There was no hesitation. When the Nightmare Legion saw the steel torrent found them at the same time. Boom! The deafening explosion became the only sound in the world. Compared with the crazy artillery fire in the base, the steel torrent was more flexible, more accurate, and more destructive. The fire occupied the entire field of vision. The Nightmare Legion had no way to retreat. There was no way to advance. The constantly forming domain was directly smashed the moment it appeared. It could not even do the most basic resistance. The Nightmare Legion, which had lost more than half of its members, was falling almost every moment. The phalanx of hundreds of people was decreasing at a speed visible to the naked eye. F***CK. At the forefront of the crowd, Li Baiqian's eyes were bloodshot. He roared, "Give up the domain. Let's rush over and kill as many as we can. I can get close to them." Lin Yuxian gritted his teeth and did not speak. Li Baiqian could indeed get close to them. The speed of the Great Void Sword was second to none in the entire Emperor Dong's palace. Not only Li Baiqian, Lin Yuxian and Bai Yuming could also get close to the large steel torrent. But it would take time. This period of time might be very short. But once they left the formation of the Nightmare Legion, the constantly forming domain could no longer be supported. This also meant that the other elites of the Nightmare Legion would be unreservedly exposed to the overwhelming artillery fire. How long would it take for them to get close to the steel torrent? 3 minutes? Or 5 minutes? In the current situation, as long as they dared to leave the Nightmare Legion's formation, it wouldn't even take a minute. Dozens of seconds would be enough to destroy everything in the Nightmare Legion. At that time, apart from the three of them, no one else would survive. However, if they didn't charge, the elites of the Nightmare Legion would indeed slow down the speed of the three of them. If this continued, they would also be annihilated in a few minutes. Should he charge now and cause enough damage to the enemy? Or should he hang on and wait for the so-called miracle? Fighting in a hopeless situation, it seemed that no matter what choice he made, it would be wrong. Our brothers can't die in vain. Li Baiqian's angry roar sounded a little faint in the sound of the explosion, but the meaning of his words was clear. It was already difficult for them to break through the last two lines of defense. Failure was right in front of them. But before they failed, they had to make the ferocious Tiger Armored Corps pay the price. A heavy price to pay. Lin Yuxian and Bai Yuming were both in the half-step invincible realm. Although Li Baiqian had not reached this realm, his combat strength had also exceeded his own realm. The three of them were the strongest, and they were also the ones who had the highest chance of charging into that distant torrent of steel. Lin Yuxian's arm trembled. The sword light went up and down in front of him. His face turned pale for a moment, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. Boom! The roaring grenade tore the domain with a long tail flame and directly enveloped Lin Yuxian's body. Everyone's face changed dramatically. In the violent roar, Lin Yoshin's body was lifted into the air and fell heavily. He struggled hard and knelt on one knee in the yellow sand. His whole body was covered with blood. "How are you?" "Sword." The light flickered. Li Beitian directly pulled Lin Yushin up and carried him on his back. Everything in front of him seemed to explain a problem. Lin Yoshin's injury had reached the point where it could not be suppressed. But the problem was that no one knew when he was injured. Was it the move that tore apart the Volcano Legion, the shattering of land? Or was it on the way to charge under the gunfire? As the Legion commander of the Nightmare Legion, Lin Yushin had always been at the forefront from the beginning to the end. He had also endured the most intense attacks. Lin Yushin forced a smile and said in a hoarse voice, "Put me down." Boom! The violent roar suddenly cut through the sky and covered Lin Yoshin's voice. All the elites of the Nightmare Legion raised their heads almost at the same time. The sunset covered the sky. Under the fiery red sky, fighter jets appeared in their field of vision one after another. The fighter jets swooped rapidly. The altitude dropped. Fire. The crazy roar was deafening. There was a lot of smoke around every fighter jet that swooped. The fighter jets that fired with all their might were getting closer and closer. In an instant, hundreds of small missiles roared and smashed into the Nightmare Legion's formation. The powerful machine guns on the fighter jets fired in the air. Bullets rained down like a torrential rain. In the intensive gunfire, the Nightmare Legion could not even launch their domain. Everything happened in a few seconds. The fighter jets swooped and then rose quickly. After the first wave of dives, the size of the entire Nightmare Legion was directly reduced by nearly half. Countless corpses and blood merged with the yellow sand. The entire Nightmare Legion stopped moving. Lin Yushin lay on Li Beitian's back, looked up at the fighter jets that circled in the air and began to dive again, and laughed. His smile was calm, but his eyes were full of despair. The ammunition is loaded. The second dive is ready at any time. The Ambition Squad is ready. The Nightmare Legion is expected to be wiped out within 3 minutes. The fighter jets were hovering in the air. In the cockpit of the leading fighter jets, clear voices kept ringing. The entire Ambition Squad had adjusted the firepower system of the fighter jets as quickly as possible. Very good. The captain of the Ambition Squad personally controlled the fighter jets. His voice was calm and indifferent. The second dive, ready, 3 to beep, beep, beep. The sharp alarm sounded abruptly. The originally quiet cabin suddenly flashed with a pale red light, which was a signal of imminent danger. The electronic, synthesized voice of the fighter's intelligence system sounded abruptly. Unknown flying target found. Distance 47,000 meters. Matching data. Long-range intercontinental missile. Matching rate 35%. Ground-to-air high-explosive missile. Matching rate 27%. Nuclear missile. Matching rate 3%. Supersonic fighter jet. Matching rate 12%. No matching data. The target cannot be analyzed. Unknown flying target found. Distance 20,000 meters. Matching data. The faces of the Ambition Squad looked like they had seen a ghost. Only the system's matching speed was extremely fast. In just a few seconds, the unknown flying object had directly closed the distance of more than 20,000 meters. What the hell was this? He suddenly turned his head. The sunset in his sight was incomparably gorgeous. The sunset was infinitely beautiful, but it was close to dusk. Just for a moment, in his sight, the whole sky seemed to be turbulent and twisted. The infinite sunset seemed to twist and flow in an instant. The sun was setting. An unimaginably dazzling light appeared in the sky. It carried with it the colors of the sunset, tearing apart the sky and covering the dusk, turning into an unimaginably ostentatious arc. The tail end of the arc was connected to the city, but the front end had flown directly into the desert. Thousands of meters, 10,000 meters, 100,000 meters, like a shocking rainbow. Unknown flying object found. Distance 12,000 meters. What unknown flying object found? Distance boom! An earth-shattering loud, noise sounded instantly. That ostentatious and presumptuous light flew into the desert, moving forward, tearing the sky and earth, penetrating everything. In the hundreds of years of the Dark World, that was the most extreme edge. The distance of tens of thousands of meters was covered in an instant. That light directly tore the fighter planes. At the moment when the violent roar sounded, the 12 fighter planes of the entire Ambition team exploded in an instant. Burning fireballs appeared in the air one after another. The light that seemed to suppress all the colors rushed out of the explosion and flames and went straight forward. The edge ran through the world. In an instant, the entire desert was torn into a huge gully with a depth of nearly 100 meters. Countless artillery fire exploded at the moment when the light moved forward. As soon as the shells in the distance rose, they were directly rolled back by the huge force. Missiles, grenades, rockets, and everything else flew in a flurry. The ray of light flew past the Nightmare Legion and the torrent of steel. The whole world seemed to be still. The explosion was suppressed in an instant. The thick armor was directly split in the air. The steel torrent was torn in an instant. In the extreme silence, there was only a piece of fire burning, but there was no sound. That light flashed away and kept moving forward. Everyone in the Nightmare Legion was dumbfounded. Most people might not know what that light was, but Li Beitian and Lin Yuxian were very clear. That was a sword light. A sword light destroyed the Ambition team and the steel torrent in 1 second. It was as easy and casual as a passing sword light. A sword light that was enough to overturn the entire Dark World. In a desert prison, Qin Weibai stood in front of the window and looked at the changing sky in the distance. She did not understand martial arts, so she could not see the light or feel the sword energy between heaven and earth. But in the distance, the wind and clouds were changing, and the sunset was turbulent. She could completely imagine the style of that sword. In the prison, Li Tianlan's figure slowly stood up. His body was extremely stiff and slow. As he moved, the joints all over his body were constantly shaking. He took a deep breath, and his figure disappeared in an instant. Outside the fierce tiger armored corps, Gu Qianquan, whose face changed dramatically, had already felt a near-fatal threat before the Ambition team was destroyed. It was completely instinctive. His figure retreated frantically. As soon as he retreated, he held the murderous weapon, Setting Sun, in his hand. His fingers tried to touch the trigger. This movement was fast, but it was too slow. For that sword light, everything was too slow. The moment the fighter plane of the Ambition team exploded, the sword light had come directly to Gu Xingyun. The incredibly sharp edge tore the domain of the invincible realm around Gu Xingyun in an instant. At the same time, it tore the murderous weapon, Setting Sun, in his hand and his body. The fragments of the murderous weapon and the flesh and blood all over the sky suddenly flew. The broken domain of the invincible realm raised a lot of yellow sand. The yellow sand was flying all over the sky. In the headquarters of the fierce tiger armored corps, Commander Lin Dong suddenly stood up with a look of horror. At this moment, in a different place in Zhongzhou State, Hidden Dragon Sea, the army headquarters building, the offices of various members of parliament. All the leaders and giants in Zhongzhou State stood up at the same time. In the surging yellow sand, they could no longer see Gu Qianquan, the setting sun, or the sword light. Chen Fanqing clenched his fists, supported his body, and stared at the screen in front of him without blinking. Countless yellow sand fell down violently. Everyone could see it clearly through the screen. The surging of the yellow sand became smooth. On the screen, a figure stood in the air. Gu Qianquan's figure had disappeared. There were only pieces of minced meat on the ground that were condensed with the yellow sand. Li Tianlan stood in the air, his eyes calm. He held a long black sword in his hand. Chapter 873. At this moment, the whole world seemed to be quiet. It was as quiet as a dream. Fierce Tiger Armored Corps, 43rd Army, Hidden Dragon Sea of Zhongzhou State, Military Headquarters Building. There are not many places but most of the power in Zhongzhou state was concentrated. Everyone who saw this picture kept absolutely quiet. People thought of the light just now, but more people thought of Gu Qianchuan. What was an instant kill? In the hundreds of years of the Dark World, since the Invincible Realm came into being, this could be said to be the fastest battle in which an Invincible Realm expert died. If this was a battle, it was like a battle, but also like a massacre. An instant kill? A second ago, the light was still 10,000 meters away. A second later, Gu Qianchuan's body had been torn into countless pieces. This was an expert who had now completely stabilized the Invincible Realm. He was an Invincible Realm expert with a murderous weapon. It was no exaggeration to say that Gu Qianchuan in this state was enough to stand at the peak of the Dark World. At least his strongest blow could rival the peak of the Invincible Realm. The light flew over from tens of thousands of meters away, tore the Ambition team, smashed the steel torrent of the entire heavy armor corps, tore the domain of the Invincible Realm expert, smashed the murderous weapon, and killed an Invincible Realm expert in an instant. The whole process didn't even take a second. Fast. Gu Qianchuan didn't even react from beginning to end. He held the murderous weapon and didn't even have time to fire. It was all like a dream. The commanders of the 43rd Army and the Fierce Tiger Armored Corps saw this picture. All the directors of Zhongzhou State saw this picture. All the members of parliament in Zhongzhou State also saw this picture. There was no joy, no anger, no excitement, no panic. The sword was too fast. Everyone couldn't even come back to their senses. What was that light? And why did Li Tianlan appear here? In different positions, everyone was watching Li Tianlan through the screen. Li Tianlan stood in the air, quiet as if he was not angry at all. The satellite of the Beijing military region kept adjusting the angle. His face became clearer and clearer. Everyone saw the look in his eyes. Stiff, dull, and dead silent. He seemed to be immersed in his own world and didn't realize what was happening here. He appeared here as if he was unconscious. Unconsciously, traversed 60 kilometers in an instant. Most of the bigwigs in Zhongzhou State shook their heads hard. They suddenly felt a little absurd, as if they were dreaming. The transparent space was constantly trembling around Li Tianlan. Beams of light appeared under Li Tianlan's feet. Tiny rays of light danced on the yellow sand, gradually moving upwards. The light shone slightly, with a touch of dim yellow, and finally surrounded the black long sword in Li Tianlan's hand. The floating light seemed to be a little hesitant, a little timid, but also full of expectation, lingering on the edge of the sword. The incredible sword tore up Gu Qianchuan and also tore the setting sun into the finest powder. The setting sun, which could already fire, still possessed spirituality. The fragments of the murderous weapon slowly floated in the air, increasing in number. The pitch-black Xianyuan blade trembled slightly. Countless faint yellow rays of light attached themselves to the edge of the sword and fused together. Sword intent pervaded the desert. The Xianyuan blade continued to tremble, its radiance growing brighter and brighter. Li Tianlan's pupils contracted slightly, and he seemed to become sober. His entire body gradually became lively, as if he had just woken up from a long period of unconsciousness. It was quiet in the desert. All the gunfire disappeared. Li Tianlan's head shook. He closed his eyes, but he saw the stars all over the sky. The stars were shining, and the moon was bright. His field of vision was flying. He flew to the highest point of the night sky and kept moving forward as fast as lightning. He flew over the central plains, Yinzhou, and Qin Island. His field of vision became dark and quiet for a moment. Li Tianlan frowned. In the sky, full of starlight, the tide rose and fell. He saw the ancestral hall of the Huangfu family, Huangfu Qiushui, and Tianguang sword. Day and night alternated. His field of vision flew away crazily. Strong wind and scorching sun. Thousands of miles of yellow sand. Nightmare core. Li Tianlan opened his eyes. He held the Xianyuan blade, and his eyes became completely clear. He loosened his palm. The Xianyuan blade, which had almost become a part of his body, slowly flowed, turned into liquid, and covered his palm. The black liquid spread along his palm, covered Li Tianlan's whole body, and turned into a gorgeous and complicated black windbreaker. The last afterglow of the setting sun shone on the golden patterns of the black windbreaker, and Li Tianlan's whole body seemed to be glowing. In the air, he took a step forward. The hem of the windbreaker was gently raised. Li Tianlan appeared directly in front of the nightmare core. The ethereal and sharp sword light suddenly pierced over. Li Beitian drew his sword out of instinct. "It's me." Li Tianlan pinched the blade of the great void sword and pressed it down slightly. It was not until this moment that Li Beitian saw Li Tianlan clearly. His palms suddenly trembled, and he opened his mouth, but he could not speak for a while. "Long time no see." Lin Yuxian coughed, wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth, and laughed. Li Tianlan looked at Lin Yuxian, whose breath was unstable, and then at Li Beitian and Bai Yuming, who were in a very bad state. His eyes swept over the remaining Nightmare Corps. Almost all the elites of the Nightmare Corps were injured, and the personnel were sparse. The Corps of less than 2,000 people at this time had less than 300 people left. This was the strongest combat capability of Emperor Dong's palace. But more than 80% of them were lost in this charge. A scarlet sword light flashed in Li Tianlan's eyes. "Sorry, I'm late," he said softly. Boom! The entire Nightmare Corps was boiling. Everyone struggled to stand up and knelt on one knee neatly. "Greetings, Your Highness." There was undisguised excitement on everyone's face. It was the joy of surviving a disaster, as well as the gratitude and fanaticism of surviving a desperate situation. Li Tianlan waved his hand. The surging sword energy pulled everyone up and made them stand straight. His expression was still calm. However, the blood-red sword light in the depths of his eyes continued to brew like a blood-red storm. "What's going on?" Li Tianlan asked aloud. "Because of the termination plan." With his back to Lin Yuxian, Li Beitian said in a hoarse voice, "Chen Fanqing wanted to kill Wang Yuedong, but the plan was exposed. So he directly sent an army to block the desert, just to prevent you from knowing the news. Great ambition, fierce tiger armored corps, the 43rd Army, and the 4 lines of defense that we tore apart were all the handiwork of Chen Fanqing and the Beijiang military region." Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows. His voice was flat and without any ups and downs. "The termination plan. Obviously, they think that Wang Yuedong will be the key between you and the Wang family of Beihai. So," Lin Yuxian sneered. "It doesn't matter," Li Tianlan said softly. Lin Yuxian was stunned. Li Tianlan did not explain. It really didn't matter. He stood here now and knew the termination plan. So what Chen Fanqing thought was not important at all. What mattered was that Chen Fanqing really blocked the desert prison, really launched the termination plan, and really wanted to imprison him in prison. Emperor Dong's palace made the most resolute counterattack for this. What mattered was that this was a war between Emperor Dong's palace and the Prince Group. What mattered was that Emperor Dong's palace paid a heavy price for this. More than 80% of the elites of the Nightmare Corps were buried in the desert. This is a war. Li Tianlan said lightly. Gu Qianchuan is not enough. He glanced at everyone in the Nightmare Corps and said softly, "I will give you an explanation." He slowly turned around and looked in the direction of the fierce tiger armored corps. The gunfire there had stopped, but the desert was shaking slightly. Behind the fierce tiger armored corps, the 43rd Army was rushing at full speed. Li Tianlan looked up at the sky. He could not see the satellite in the sky. But as he looked up, everyone in Zhongzhou State who was paying close attention to the battlefield felt that Li Tianlan was looking at them. He twitched the corner of his mouth. In everyone's sight, Li Tianlan raised his palm. "They are all enemies," he said. A sword suddenly sounded between heaven and earth. Li Tianlan's windbreaker suddenly fluttered. The black windbreaker instantly left Li Tianlan's body. Another streak of sword light appeared in the barren desert. The unparalleled sword light seemed to light up in Li Tianlan's hand. The moment the light lit up, there was an earth-shattering roar and explosion 10 kilometers away. The explosion that seemed to overturn the whole desert was endless. Li Tianlan's voice fell. Countless shells exploded in the base of the fierce tiger armored core one after another. Thick smoke and raging fire rose in the distance, twisting the space. In the base of the fierce tiger armored core, everything turned into a huge mushroom cloud in the explosion. The sword light shuttled all the way forward and rushed directly into the formation of the 43rd Army. Behind the camp of the 43rd Army, the undead, who was excitedly preparing to play a new game with Xiao Mahai, looked up in astonishment. His world was spinning crazily. The blood all over the sky kept spraying with the head flying in the air. The sword light cut off the flagpole. Xiao Mahai's body fell down. The sword light continued to fly and instantly reached the back of the 43rd Army. The sharp edge directly tore the huge tent of the headquarters. Blood and minced meat burst out of the broken tent. The sword light that had been moving forward flashed and came directly to Xiao Mahai. Before Xiao Mahai's body landed, it turned into a windbreaker and put it on him. Chapter 874. What was sword light? That sounded like a load of crap. But in fact, for those who were obsessed with martial arts, especially swordsmanship, this was actually a very interesting question, and it also represented two directions of swordsmanship. There had been debates about this in the Dark World, but there had never been an authoritative answer, and it was destined that there could not be an authoritative answer. Different people, different forces, different swordsmanship, different ideas, and everyone's understanding of sword light was different. The so-called sword light. Was it a sword, or was it light? The former represented sharpness. The latter represented speed. Different martial artists had different answers in their hearts, and their answers were also the direction they were pursuing. In Li Baiqian's heart, sword light was light. The great void sword intent was ethereal, unpredictable, agile, and illusory. It looked complicated, but it was extremely pure. The only essence of the great void sword was speed. Li Baiqian said a long time ago that he was at the late stage, and the fact did prove it. Before entering the thunder-shocking realm, he was also a genius, but to be honest, he was not very outstanding. He used to rank fourth among the top 10 young experts in Zhongzhou State. At that time, he had not yet entered the fire-flaming realm. And during the period from the fire-flaming realm to the thunder-shocking realm, the great void sword seemed to fade into the crowd. Under the fire-flaming realm, he could still support his height with the foundation of Mount Shu. But in the fire-flaming realm, his weakness had been infinitely magnified. He was not fast enough, and the destructive power of the great void sword intent was not strong. But all this was completely different after entering the thunder-shocking realm. The physical quality that could withstand the power of the thunder-shocking realm could already support the essence of the great void sword. With the thunder-shocking realm as the foundation, Li Baiqian's combat capability could be said to grow explosively every time he made progress. The lethality of the great void sword might still not be strong, but its speed was getting faster and faster. Speed. This was everything Li Baiqian pursued. From the thunder-shocking realm to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, to the half-step invincible realm, and even to the invincible realm and the peak of the invincible realm. The only thing Li Baiqian needed was speed. He didn't need lethality. Extreme speed could completely let him destroy everything. This was his martial arts and belief. When he was in the ice-freezing mirror, Li Baiqian was ranked behind Dongcheng Rushi on the list of the top 10 young experts. Now, Li Baiqian, who was already at the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, could even suppress Dongcheng Rushi, who was in the same realm as him. In this state, Li Baiqian's supreme void was enough to make most of the experts in the same realm as him have no time to react. Correspondingly, the Shushan Nirvana sword had a completely opposite concept. Before Wei Kunlun entered the invincible realm, the sword light in his eyes was a sword. Therefore, regardless of whether he was a saint or a Nirvana sword master, his sword was extremely heavy, majestic, and mighty. These two paths practically represented two general directions of the sword Dao, and they were equally matched. That was what Li Baiqian had always thought, until he saw the sword light, that almost unimaginable sword light. 10,000 meters in the blink of an eye, indestructible and unstoppable. In an instant, it destroyed the Ambition battle team, destroyed the Heavy Armor Legion, killed the Invincible Realm, and tore apart the murderous weapon. In an instant, it rushed into the base of the Ferocious Tiger Armored Corps and the military formation of the 43rd Army. That was unimaginable speed and unimaginable sharpness. It was not until the light brought Xiao Mahai back to Li Tianlan that the first explosion sounded in the distance of the Ferocious Tiger Armored Corps. No human could do that. Li Beitian could be sure of that. However, the sword chi and the sword light seemed to show Li Beitian a new direction. What was sword light? Sword light was sword light. Compromise was not the only thing that could take care of everything. There was also perfection. The black windbreaker wrapped around Xiao Mahai reappeared in front of Li Tianlan. The black windbreaker slowly unfurled, bringing with it a soft curtain of light. Light. The curtain floated in the air, motionless and extremely stable. The windbreaker fell off Xiao Mahai and was put on Li Tianlan again. Xiao Mahai lay on the light curtain, motionless. Li Tianlan quietly looked at Xiao Mahai, who was in a coma. His eyes were getting colder and colder. Tianlan. Li Beitian hesitated for a moment before calling out. Li Tianlan didn't move. Li Beitian looked at the windbreaker that gradually turned into a cloak on him and said seriously, "What the hell is this?" A corner of the black cloak was raised. The sword energy fell softly on the yellow sand. It seemed that someone had put a pen on the ground. Two big words appeared in the yellow sand. It was like Li Tianlan's handwriting, but every stroke was sharper than Li Tianlan's. Ruthless? Li Beitian raised his eyebrows slightly. It had many names. Xianyuan Feng. 13-story building. Xianyuan sword, but now in this state. That's its name, Li Tianlan said quietly. In the building of the army headquarters, Dongqing Wudi's body slowly relaxed. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. That's how it should be. It's good to die. Damn, it's comfortable. On the sofa in the office, Bai Qingzhao kept adjusting the screen and muttered to himself with undisguised excitement and relaxation. He was still watching the scene when the sword light left Li Tianlan's palm. On the screen, Li Tianlan raised his palm. The sword light disappeared in a flash. The base of the fierce tiger armored corps suddenly lit up with a large fire. The sword light rushed into the military formation of the 43rd Army without any pause. The charging formation of the 43rd Army didn't react at all, and the sword light had flown straight along the center of the military formation. Flesh and blood were flying all over the sky. The sword light had reached the rear of the 43rd Army. The flagpole hanging Xiao Mahai was cut off. At the same time the flagpole was broken, the sword light had cut the undead and appeared in the tent of the headquarters. The scene in that moment was too fast. Ouyang Pengfei, the commander of the 43rd Army, seemed to raise his hand. Then the figures of the officers of the 43rd Army who were discussing countermeasures and several experts of Kunlun City disappeared completely. The tent was completely torn apart. There was only blood left in the tent. When the explosion sounded, the sword light had brought Xiao Mahai back to Li Tianlan's side. Fast. It all happened too fast. How fast was it? The most advanced military satellite in the sky could only capture a light. The light shuttled back and forth, and the whole process was just a blink of an eye. Bai Qingzhao fixed this second, slowed it down, decomposed it, and finally turned it into a video of about 7 or 8 seconds. Everything happened too fast. Being able to break it down into 7 or 8 seconds was already the limit of a satellite. He stared at the sword light without blinking. The speed of the sword light in the video was completely constant. It flew across the sky, passed through the crowd, and tore apart the gunpowder warehouse of the armored army. Everything is constant. There was no acceleration or deceleration during the entire process. It was as if everything in its path didn't exist, and all obstacles were torn apart in an instant. It was so stable and majestic that it made one's scalp go numb. All right, Bai Qingzhao slapped his thigh and shouted, "Dongqing Wudi, watch your attitude." He sat up straight, and looked at Bai Qingzhao with a serious expression. His tone was meaningful. Bai Qingzhao was a little puzzled, but he immediately understood. He put down the remote control in his hand, nodded, and said, "Yes." They Dongxing Wudi pointed to the screen. "Everyone who sacrificed in the desert today, every soldier, whether in the north or the south, whether it's the border military or the Nightmare Legion, everyone is a hero, a martyr. No one deserves to die. They may not be innocent, but they are not the ones who should be responsible for it. Everyone who sacrificed in the desert today is worthy of the title of Zhongzhou State Soldier. No matter who is responsible for everything today, they are all heroes." Dongxing Wudi said slowly. "I see." Bai Qingzhao took a deep breath and nodded. "Are you relieved now?" Dongxing Wudi chuckled. Bai Qingzhao also smiled. He lay on the sofa and looked at the ceiling, motionless. "If you can still move now, come with me," Dongxing Wudi said. "Where to?" Bai Qingzhao sat up straight. "Beijiang." Dongxing Wudi's tone was calm. The army headquarters should have an attitude towards everything that happened today. Many people in Zhongzhou State also needed to know the attitude of the army headquarters. He looked at Li Tianlan on the screen and felt a little emotional. From the moment he entered the desert prison, the giant group had been under pressure from the outside world during the internal shuffle. Now it was time to fight back. "Let's go." Without saying anything, Bai Qingzhao directly picked up the coat on the sofa. Dongxing Wudi walked out of the office. "Tell me," Bai Qingzhao followed Dongxing Wudi. He hesitated and said slowly, "Has Tianlan entered the invincible realm now? Does it matter?" Dongxing Wudi laughed. "Whether he has entered the invincible realm or not, from today on, the era of Emperor Dawn's palace has officially arrived." Xiao Mahai was still in a coma. No one knew how long he had been caught by Gu Qianchuan. But at this moment, there was almost no intact place on his body. The sword energy turned into a cloud and dragged him. Li Tianlan stood in front of him. Countless water-like sword qi flowed out of his hand, slowly wrapping Xiao Mahai inside layer by layer. It took a long time. Xiao Mahai became more and more blurred in the sword energy. He looked like a transparent rice dumpling or amber. After doing all this, Li Tianlan gently waved his hand and said, "Send him to the hospital, stabilize his injury, and then send him to Yuzhou." "Let me do it, Your Highness." Fairy Tale, who was a little pale, took a step forward and steadily carried the sword energy amber on his back. Li Tianlan glanced at him. He had never seen Fairy Tale before, but he knew of his existence. Looking at his face, Li Tianlan asked, "How are you?" "I can still hold on. I'll take General Xiao to the hospital first." Fairy Tale smiled. His smile was a little ugly, and his voice was a little hoarse. "Just now, before you came, Fairy Tale's cousin sacrificed himself," Li Beitian whispered. Li Tianlan was silent for a moment. He reached out and patted Fairy Tale on the shoulder, whispering, "Go first." Fairy Tale nodded and quickly left with the amber on his back. Li Tianlan turned his head and looked at the Nightmare Troop behind him. All the members of the Nightmare Troop were standing. In the direction they came from, corpses were scattered in the desert. As the wind rose and fell, they were slowly drowned by the yellow sand. "They can't be here." Li Tianlan stared at the scene in front of him. "Find all the brothers and send them back to Tianan." His figure flickered and carefully dug out a corpse of the Nightmare Troop that was gradually drowned. The people of the Nightmare Troop were stunned. Li Tianlan didn't look up. He said lightly, "Send all the brothers who sacrificed themselves home. You, come with me to take revenge." The explanation was for his own people. Li Tianlan didn't need to explain to the enemy. The hatred was so obvious in front of him. He only needed revenge. What explanation did he need? He could do whatever he wanted. Chapter 875. The corpses were sorted out one by one. Li Tianlan suddenly raised his head. A loud rumble rang out in the distant sky. The silhouette of the fighter appeared in his line of sight from afar. The fighter continued to increase in altitude, but it did not approach. Instead, It drew an arc in the air and began to return. Li Tianlan silently watched the fighter plane disappear and said nothing. The black cloak was draped over his body, and he did not make any unnecessary movements. The Beijiang military region still hasn't given up. Lin Yuxian, with a pale face, carried the corpses with Li Tianlan. He was seriously injured. Li Tianlan could clearly feel his weakness, but he still held on and found the corpses of his subordinates one by one. Apart from the heavily injured, the entire Nightmare Army was on the move. The 6 defensive lines of the blockade were all part of their search area. Li Beitian, who was in the best condition, brought some people to the area of the special forces in the wasteland. Bai Yuming was in the middle with a group of people. Li Tianlan and the seriously injured Lin Yuxian led a group of people to look for the dead on the road from the volcano core to the Tiger Armored Core. This section of the road was the shortest, but the number of people who died was also the highest. It's not the Beijiang military district. Li Tianlan shook his head. They're from the Air Force. Li Tianlan shook his head. Beijiang can't mobilize that type of fighter jet. He don't lie? Lin Yuxian said thoughtfully. So they are allies. So we'll be able to send our brothers back soon. Li Tianlan said softly. His voice was calm and emotionless. It was a state of extreme repression. It was faint, but it was cold enough to make one's scalp go numb. There were less than 300 survivors in the Nightmare Legion out of 1,600 people. For Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace, this was an unbearable loss. He was nurturing his sword in the desert prison. All his thoughts were immersed in swordsmanship. In that state, the concept of time became very vague. For him, it was like he had just woken up from a long trance. As soon as he opened his eyes, someone told him that the top combat power of Emperor Dong's palace had been reduced by more than half. But the one who attacked was not an enemy. He had his own ideas and ambitions, but from the beginning to the end, he had never placed Zhongzhou's state as an enemy. Someone who wasn't his enemy had almost destroyed everything he had. If Heartless had come a little later, if he had awoken a little later, a few minutes late, the entire Nightmare Legion would be annihilated. Lin Yuxian, Bai Yuming, Li Beitian, everyone will die here. What would be left of Emperor Dong's palace at that time? How could he face the Lin clan, Mount Shu, the Bai family, and even the giant group in the future? Li Tianlan pursed his lips tightly. His body trembled slightly. Countless emotions surged in his heart. There was fear, joy, anger, hatred, but most of all, there was a brutal desire to tear everything apart. All the emotions were stuck in his chest, making it hard for him to breathe. The cloak draped over him clearly felt Li Tianlan's killing intent. The huge cloak trembled slightly, and the hem of the cloak fluttered, turning back into a huge pitch-black sword. Li Tianlan held the hilt, closed his eyes, and remained silent for a long time. What's your plan? Lin Yuxian seemed to understand something. He looked at the pitch-black Xianyuan foam and asked softly, "An eye for an eye." Li Tianlan let go of the sword in his hand and let the huge sword float beside him. Once again, he suppressed the emotions in his heart. That's the Prime Minister. Lin Yuxian looked at Li Tianlan seriously. Really? Li Tianlan asked faintly in reply. Lin Yuxian's body shook, and his scalp was really numb at this moment. Everyone has to pay the price. Everyone involved in this matter will be counted as one. No one will be able to escape. Li Tianlan and Lin Yuxian found the corpses of the dead and put them together. His eyes became calmer and calmer. They have to pay the price. He kept muttering to himself, they have to pay the price. The sun set completely. A gust of wind blew in the desert. The wind blew the yellow sand and quickly took away the temperature of the desert. Li Tianlan slowly raised his head and looked into the distance. A sword light appeared in the distance. The sword light wrapped the outline of a human figure and kept approaching Li Tianlan's position. Li Tianlan stood where he was, motionless. The sword light stopped in front of Li Tianlan. The outline in the light gradually became clear, revealing Lin Fengting's somewhat complicated face. He silently looked at the surrounding desert and the neatly gathered corpses. After a long silence, he whispered, "I'm late. This is a matter between Emperor Dong's palace and the prince group. Li Tianlan shook his head. At most, the Wang family of Beihai has nothing to do with the Lin clan. I didn't say it out of anger. Lin Fengting raised his eyebrows and glanced at Lin Yuxian. Lin Yuxian nodded slightly. Although time was limited, there were some things he still had to say in the process of sorting out the corpses. For example, Chun Fangxing and the Prince Group, the termination plan, the current blockade plan, and even how the war started after the Nightmare Troop arrived in the desert. So Li Tianlan directly targeted the Prince Group. What's your plan? Lin Fengting asked the same question that Lin Yuxian had just asked, which was exactly the same question. Li Tianlan's answer was exactly the same. An eye for an eye. He lowered his head and moved forward step by step, looking for the corpses under the yellow sand in the darkening dusk. Don't be impulsive. Lin Fengting frowned. You know what Qin Fangqing means to Zhongzhou State. Yes, I know. Li Tianlan bent down, picked up a corpse, and walked back. He said slowly, but now it seems that no one knows what he means to Zhongzhou State. I'll let them know. He carefully put down the corpse. I said before I entered the desert that I was the overall situation of Zhongzhou State. It seems that no one took my words seriously, so I don't need to take them seriously. This time, I won't go too far, and no one is qualified to ask me to focus on the overall situation. He pointed to the dense corpses in front of him. His fingers trembled in the last twilight, and his voice also trembled. My overall situation was broken by them. Lin Fengting looked at Li Tianlan's trembling fingers and was silent for a while. Then he whispered, "The dark world has been a little chaotic recently. To some extent, it seems to have something to do with the Prince Group. This time, the Prince Group can use at least 5 invincible realm experts to target Beihai and Emperor Dong's palace. You know what I mean? 5 invincible realm experts?" Li Tianlan's voice was a little indifferent. I'm talking about at least. Lin Fengting's tone was serious. How many invincible realm experts can there be in the entire Dark World now? This blockade operation is just the beginning. Next, there will be the final battle in Beihai. It's hard for Situ, Sangyue, and Saint to take action in this battle. The Dark Knights are in a mess now. I can't participate in the final battle either. The Wang family of Beihai does have a trump card, but unless you don't participate in the final battle in Beihai, it's very likely that you will face at least 5 or even more invincible realm experts alone. But now things have developed to this point. If you don't stand on Beihai's side, it's impossible to replace Kunlun City. It has nothing to do with what I'm going to do. Li Tianlan said blandly, whether I do it or not, the final battle in Beihai will happen eventually. There will be many invincible realm experts. If there are only 5 invincible realm experts, I can deal with them. Because of Ruthless? Lin Fengting gestured to Xianyuan Feng, who was floating beside Li Tianlan. If you join forces with it, you can indeed deal with 5 invincible realm experts. In Ruthless' current state, you can even deal with double the number. But how long can Ruthless last in this state? In other words, if Ruthless can't stay with you, what can you do to deal with them? I didn't say it. Li Tianlan looked at Lin Fengting. 5 invincible realm experts. I can deal with them. Lin Fengting, Lin Yuxian, invincible realm. Li Tianlan looked at Lin Fengting. You're also afraid of death. The father and son looked at Li Tianlan in a daze and couldn't speak for a while. What realm are you in now? Lin Fengting took a deep breath. He seemed to feel a little ridiculous, and his tone was full of disbelief. Invincible realm? No. Li Tianlan said quietly. The night slowly enveloped the desert. Li Tianlan raised his hand and snapped his fingers. An extremely gentle light appeared in the darkness. The light jumped in his hand and instantly covered the desert with a radius of hundreds of meters. The light was like thunder, like flames, and like pure sword light. In the light, Li Tianlan looked at Lin Fengting. It doesn't matter whether I'm in the invincible realm or not, he said blandly. The important thing is that even if I don't enter the invincible realm, I'm invincible in the dark world now. Not in the invincible realm, but in the invincible realm. Lin Fengting felt the light around him and the sword energy around him, and his face changed little by little. Li Tianlan didn't hide any details. The light in front of him was soft, but with Lin Fengting's realm, he could naturally see the abnormality. He could feel the state of this sword energy. He could also feel Li Tianlan's state at the moment when he made his move. His face kept changing, extremely complicated, and finally turned into undisguised admiration. Amazing, he said softly. Heresy. Li Tianlan shook his head. Lin Fengting laughed. He really didn't expect that Li Tianlan would take such a path during the time when he kept the sword in the desert. At his age, he was destined not to enter the invincible realm. Therefore, the path before him was undoubtedly the best one. Heresy is also a path, he said softly. Li Tianlan didn't speak. His eyes crossed the desert and looked at the night sky in the distance. In silence, his eyes were full of bloodlight. Chapter 876. The movement of the Nightmare Legion was not fast, nor could it be. It was not easy to find more than 1,000 corpses in a 40-kilometer battle line, and as time passed, the elites who had been sacrificed at the beginning had been completely buried by the yellow sand, making the search even more difficult. The most important thing was manpower. In such a large area with so many corpses, Emperor Dong's palace could only send 300 people to search. Lin Fengting stared blankly at the increasing number of corpses in front of him. The Nightmare Army was the main force in breaking through the blockade. To be exact, his son, Lin Yuxian, was the leader. All the orders were issued by Lin Yuxian. That included giving up on sorting out their comrades' corpses. He did not feel that the Nightmare Army was cold-blooded and did not care about the corpses of their comrades. Instead, this action showed the determination of the Nightmare Army. No one cleaned up the corpses of their comrades, because no one planned to go back alive. Specks of light covered the vast desert. The night in the desert was beautiful and stunning. The hazy and bright light of the moon and stars quietly sprinkled on the desert, blending with the sword chi that illuminated the desert. It was dreamy and warm. Wisps of sword intent seemed to have merged with the desert. The light within hundreds of meters kept moving. Li Tianlan alone found corpses in the yellow sand and went further and further. Lin Fengting watched all this quietly and suddenly looked back at Lin Yuxian sitting next to him. Lin Yuxian's face was pale and bloodless. His aura fluctuated continuously, fluctuating between high and low. He had just used the recovery potion of the Lin clan. With the effect of the potion, unimaginable exhaustion filled his whole body. After the tension in his heart was released, he only felt weak. Is it worth it? Lin Fengting suddenly asked. What? Lin Yuxian shook his head hard and looked at his father. Everything. Lin Fengting asked. There is everything, including everything. Was it all worth it? Was it worth it for the Nightmare Army to turn out in full strength to fight against Zhongzhou's state and break the blockade? Was it worth it to lose more than half of the Nightmare Legion? Facing tens of thousands of soldiers and countless cannons, was it worth it for everyone to charge with the courage to die? As the heir of the Lin clan, was it worth it to give up the identity of heir and become a branch to rebuild Zhuanyuantai? Was it worth risking his life for Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace? It was not that he had no other choice. Lin Yuxian had a choice. He had many choices, but he didn't choose anything. Was it worth it? Lin Yuxian was silent for a long time before he said softly, "The Nightmare Core must appear here." The most important thing for Emperor Dong's palace to develop to this stage is momentum. In any case, this momentum cannot be suppressed at all. For the sake of Xianyuan City, Tianlan wiped out the whole Qi family. He had a standpoint, but he was also at fault first. 2 years in the desert is nothing, but this time is different. Plan termination was Chun Fengqing's mistake, or rather, it was his own stupidity. He did something wrong, but after it was exposed, he sealed off the desert prison. Why? From the beginning to the end, Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace were right. However, Zhongzhou's state blocked the news in an extremely tough manner and tried to suppress Emperor Dong's palace. He was too optimistic. I dare say that if Emperor Dong's palace tolerated it this time, regardless of what the outside world would think, Chun Fanqing would be even more insatiable in the future. So, the Nightmare Core must appear here. No matter what, even if everyone dies here, we must charge. Emperor Dong's palace is not a place that can be easily bullied. Lin Fengding took a deep look at his son and said with a smile, "Besides this, what else? Your identity is different." Lin Yuxian looked at the neatly arranged corpses around him. He reached out and held the palm of one of the corpses. The thick palm was extremely cold and stiff. He still remembered the name of this brother. He was from Suzhou and had mediocre qualities. But he was obsessed with martial arts and was also one of the thorns of the Nightmare Core. He was an expert at the peak of the fire-flaming realm. When he was in Tiannan, he liked to learn from others when he had nothing to do. He even asked Lin Yuxian for help. When facing the artillery fire all over the sky, he tried his best to cooperate with Lin Yuxian to support the pseudo-domain. He was the first expert at the peak of the fire-flaming realm to die under the artillery fire. Lin Yuxian held his palm quietly. After a long time, he whispered, "It's the same." Lin Fengding sighed and shook his head. He patted him on the shoulder and said in a low voice, "It's good to be alive." Lin Yuxian did not speak. Lin Fengding slowly reached out and grabbed a handful of yellow sand. The subtle light merged with the yellow sand and was held in his hand at the same time. Lin Fengding quietly looked at the shining yellow sand in his hand. After a long silence, he sighed softly and said, "The Prince Group is finished." Lin Fengding froze and looked at his father in astonishment. He heard it very clearly. What Lin Fengding said was that the Prince Group was finished. It was not that Chun Fanqing was finished. If the individual and the whole were shown in Zhongzhou state, it would be a completely different situation. If Chun Fanqing was finished, there would be no change in the current situation. After all, he was a person who was about to retire. But if the Prince Group collapsed, the entire Zhongzhou state would fall into a violent turmoil. Is it so serious? Lin Yuxian frowned. Lin Fengding pinched the sand in his hand, and a faint light flowed in his hand. It looked very gentle, even warm, but he could only feel an almost insane killing intent from the extremely subtle sword qi. It came from Li Qianlan's killing intent. Emperor Dong's palace, he whispered, looking at the whole dark world, all resources are limited, especially power resources. In a relatively balanced environment, the rise of a behemoth does not mean the weakening of other forces of the same level. It is more likely to mean the disappearance of another behemoth. It's a good opportunity right now, even the only opportunity. And Tianlan is already qualified. Lin Yuxian's mood was a little complicated. He thought of what Li Tianlan had just said. Even if I haven't entered the invincible realm, I am invincible in the current dark world. When he said this, Li Tianlan's voice was very soft, but with absolute confidence. If there is no ruthlessness, Lin Yuxian hesitated and whispered, to what extent can Tianlan do? He believed that Li Tianlan could indeed defeat everyone in the dark world with Xianyuan Feng, especially in the current state of Xianyuan Feng. The sword that tore the sky just now was enough to explain the problem. That kind of extremely powerful sword energy could sweep across the entire dark world without Li Tianlan's help. In this state, Xianyuan Feng was ruthless. But he could not always be ruthless. Xianyuan Feng was Xianyuan Feng. No matter how many murderous weapons were combined, in essence, Xianyuan Feng was always a murderous weapon. It could also be said to be a life, but it was a life supported by endless energy. On the other hand, the energy that Xianyuan Feng needed would take a long time to accumulate. Now ruthlessness was a murderous weapon that had been fully charged. It could burst out the power to destroy the world at any time. Compared with other murderous weapons, the only difference was that it was more complete and could use its power more rationally. When other murderous weapons opened fire, they would completely burst out the accumulated energy. But ruthlessness was a murderous weapon that could continue to burst out. But no matter how much it continued to burst out, its energy was limited. The sword just now was destined to consume a lot of ruthlessness's energy, and part of this energy would be made up by setting Sunday. But anyway, as long as ruthlessness burst out, it was impossible to achieve a real balance. It would also fall into silence. After all the energy was used up, it would continue to replenish energy. At that time, ruthlessness would still have a will, but without energy, it was just Xianyuan Feng, just a sword. Li Tianlan could sweep the dark world with ruthlessness. But after sweeping the dark world, ruthlessness became Xianyuan Feng, and Li Tianlan was still Li Tianlan. How strong was Li Tianlan now, without the help of external objects? Lin Yuxian smiled and said, before he entered the desert, there was a saying in the dark world. With the 13-story building, he was the #1 expert in the dark world besides me. But that was the sword formation of the 13-story building. What if there was no sword formation? Lin Yuxian frowned. Why don't you ask yourself how strong you will be without a sword? Or how strong you will be if you lose your hands? Lin Fengting laughed. He reached out and touched his son's head. The 13-story building is a sword formation and also a sword, but it can't be said to be an external object. In the final analysis, the so-called external object is ruthlessness after it has accumulated enough energy. Without energy, the 13-story building and Xianyuan Feng are cold weapons, just like the sword in your hand. The sword formation of the 13-story building is not important. The important thing is that Tianlan can use it. It is his own understanding and kendo to drive the 13-story building. It is his own ability and his own sword formation. Of course, it can also be regarded as his own combat capability. In other words, if you ask me how strong I am now, do you want to ask me how strong I am without the 24 moves of sword? Lin Yuxian scratched his head. Lin Fengting turned to look at Li Tianlan's back, narrowed his eyes, and whispered. During this time, he can be said to be cultivating swords in the desert prison. But to be exact, he is studying the sword formation of the 13-story building and finding the most suitable method. Now, the sword formation of the 13-story building can be said to be his own sword formation. If Lin Yuxian was a little hesitant. He shook his head, changed the direction, and asked directly, Dad, is he your opponent now? Lin Fengting narrowed his eyes and thought seriously for a long time. His expression was a little dignified. He slowly shook his head and said, it's hard to say. The word hard to say could represent many things, but the most intuitive meaning was that Lin Fengting was not sure. Lin Yuxian took a deep breath, opened his eyes wide, and looked at Li Tianlan. It was not until this moment that he really understood Li Tianlan's current level. He smiled bitterly and muttered to himself, how is this possible? He was not arrogant, nor did he belittle himself. Lin Yuxian always felt that no matter who he compared with, he would not be too bad. Even if Li Tianlan had led him a lot in terms of combat capability, the actual distance between the two would not be too far. But now, the extremely clear facts were in front of him. Li Tianlan's level had far exceeded the younger generation and was even infinitely close to his father. How did he do it? You're no longer in the invincible realm. Lin Yuxian's tone was a little excited. Lin Fengting was indeed seriously injured now, but he had officially broken through the peak of the invincible realm and was only half a step away from the supreme realm. And Li Tianlan had not yet entered the invincible realm. How is this possible? Are you hit? Lin Fengting looked at Lin Yuxian with a faint smile. Lin Yuxian was muddle-headed and shook his head with a bitter smile. He only felt that his injury seemed to be a little worse. In the normal state, he is still not my opponent. After all, Tianlan has not really entered the invincible realm. The unorthodox way, he said, is equivalent to a trick. His current state is relatively special. How strong his combat capability is depends on his physical coordination. Physical coordination? Lin Yuxian was stunned. Lin Fengting nodded. That is balance. Lin Yuxian did not speak. Balance? He shook his head and thought that this should be what the Lin clan and the Li family were best at. Chapter 877. The night was getting darker. The glimmer of light in the desert was constantly expanding. The corpses of the nightmare army were found one by one. 100, 500, 1,000. Li Tianlan walked farther and farther. The corpses of the dead were neatly placed together. Countless lights shone around the corpses, isolating all the wind and sand. Tianlan. In the slight sound of footsteps, Li Baiqian's figure came from afar. "I'm done over there." Li Tianlan nodded and carefully dug out a corpse that was almost completely buried by the yellow sand. "Give me a hand." Li Baiqian bent down and lifted the corpse's legs. He said in a low voice, "What should we do now?" He was responsible for sorting out the corpses at the forefront of the battle line. There were fewer dead in that distance, so it was relatively easier to find them. But even so, it was still an unbearable number if measured by human lives. How could more than 1,000 corpses be sent back to Tiannan in an area of tens of kilometers? This position was more than 100 kilometers away from the nearest city in Beijiang. And the culprit of all this was the Beijiang military region. Beijiang had not even cleaned up the corpses of its own people, let alone come to Emperor Dong's palace. How could the bodies of more than 1,000 dead elites be sorted out across thousands of kilometers to Tiannan? The Air Force will find a way. Li Tianlan thought of the latest fighter jet he had seen not long ago and shook his head. If not, we'll send them in batches. The nearest province to Beijiang was Suzhou Province. Under the situation that Beijiang was watching, the Air Force could only mobilize the Suzhou Air Force if they wanted to intervene. But it was a desert, and large transport planes could not land at all. Even if they could land, they could not take off again. So the only choice was to send the bodies to Suzhou by helicopter and then send them to Tiannan by transport plane from Suzhou. "I'll stay here. You send the brothers home," Li Tianlan said. "Count all their identities and compensate them as much as possible. Don't worry, leave it to me." Li Baiqian nodded. Li Tianlan nodded. The faint light continued to extend, and the sword energy slowly pushed forward. Soon, he found another corpse. Li Baiqian hesitated and was about to say something. In the distant night, a dazzling light suddenly shone over. Li Tianlan stopped bending down, straightened up, and squinted at the night sky in the distance. The rotors whistled from far to near. 2 armed helicopters slowly approached Li Tianlan. The dazzling searchlights swept across the desert and scrupulously. The approaching helicopter kicked up a strong gust of wind. As if on purpose, 2 helicopters slowly hovered above Li Tianlan's head. The people in the helicopter did not speak. Only the searchlight kept sweeping Li Tianlan's body. Li Baiqian raised his head and looked at the symbol of the Northern Frontier Army on the helicopter. He looked at the searchlights that kept sweeping over, and his face darkened. In the cabin of the helicopter, a middle-aged man in a military uniform looked down at Li Tianlan expressionlessly and said nothing. The dazzling light was aimed directly at Li Tianlan's eyes, and the strong light shrouded his whole body. "Ah!" Li Tianlan laughed. He raised his palm. There was no hesitation, no fear. An extremely sharp sword light suddenly bloomed in his palm. The sword light rushed up into the sky, and as it continued to extend, it directly turned into a huge sword that was over 100 meters tall. The sharp light illuminated the sky, and the huge sword did not stop as it directly chopped down. F*CK land. In the leading helicopter, the middle-aged man's face suddenly changed. The blade of the huge sword flashed away in the air. Boom! In a violent roar, the fuselage of the second helicopter exploded in an instant, and a strong flame rose in the air. The searchlights disappeared. Li Tianlan waved his hand. The awe-inspiring sword energy flew in his hand. A helicopter. Before the wreckage and fire of the helicopter landed on the ground, they had been completely smashed into pieces by the sword energy. The helicopter, the fire, and the people on the helicopter all disappeared. The corner of Li Baiqian's mouth twitched. He did not speak, but just walked to Li Tianlan's side. The helicopter slowly descended. Before it completely landed, the cabin door had been violently pulled open. Li Tianlan! In a furious roar, The middle-aged man jumped directly from the helicopter and roared furiously, "Do you know what you are doing?" Li Tianlan looked at him expressionlessly. The man was about in his early 50s. His military uniform was neat, and his momentum was majestic and domineering. The faint light of the desert illuminated his epaulets. The rank of lieutenant general was shining in the night. A large number of military medals hung on his chest, making him look iron-blooded and majestic. Li Baiqian's eyes fell on the military medals on the man's chest. He hesitated and did not say anything. He could see that the man was a real fierce general. Those military medals were enough to represent a lot of things. The military medals of the team might be exaggerated, but several of the military medals of the individual were real contributions. What did the man want to express by wearing them on his chest? Li Baiqian glanced at Li Tianlan and did not speak. "They are all soldiers of Zhongzhou State." The lieutenant general's voice was loud and angry. But Li Tianlan did not bother to listen at all. He directly interrupted the man's roar. "Say it." The lieutenant general's momentum slightly stagnated. "I'm the deputy of the Beijiang military region. Say it." Li Tianlan looked into his eyes. "Or don't say it." The lieutenant general's eyes flickered, and then he sneered. "Well, your highness is really domineering, but don't forget your own position." He stared at Li Tianlan, and all his strength seemed to be on his face. The Beijiang military region held a large-scale confrontation maneuver in the desert. The nightmare troop of Emperor Dong's palace inexplicably ran to the desert prison and launched a war against us. Tens of thousands of soldiers of Beijiang stained the desert with their blood. Emperor Dong's palace must give Beijiang and Zhongzhou State an explanation for this matter. As a prisoner of the desert prison, you actually left the range of the desert prison. Li Tianlan, you must also give Zhongzhou State an explanation for this matter. His Highness Gu Qianchuan was inspecting the scene of the maneuver, but he was directly killed by you. The Invincible Realm is the pillar of the country. Your behavior is equivalent to treason. He looked at Li Tianlan with no expression. Less than 200 kilometers away from you, the Beijiang Airbird Missile Base is monitoring everything here. Li Tianlan, tell me who ordered you to do all this, and then get back to the desert prison. This is your last chance. Li Tianlan did not speak. Li Baiqian, who stood beside Li Tianlan, opened his eyes wide and was stunned for a moment. Confrontation maneuver? Did your family use live ammunition in the confrontation maneuver? When the Nightmare Corps arrived in the desert, it was the Huangsha Corps who took the initiative to open fire. Did you say that the Nightmare Corps initiated the war? Obviously, the other party came here at this time not only to test Li Tianlan's attitude after the blockade action. What else did they want to do? Li Baiqian's heart was cold, but the anger deep in his heart suddenly rushed up. He couldn't help taking a step forward and directly cursed. "You mother of Asterisker." Li Tianlan reached out and stopped Li Baiqian. He looked at the lieutenant general in front of him quietly and laughed softly. "I really don't know who gave you the courage to stand here," Li Tianlan said softly. His voice was as soft as the wind, with an extremely cold aura that seemed to blow into people's bones. "Is it Chun Fangqing? Is it Huang Tong? Or is it your so-called missile base?" The lieutenant general's face changed. He resisted the urge to take a step back and said in a deep voice, "You'd better know what you're talking about. Do you really want to commit treason?" Thousands of soldiers of Emperor Dong's palace are now lying in the desert. Who is responsible? The army of Beijiang killed them, and now you want me to bear the consequences? What are you going to do with all those military medals? Lieutenant General? Swagger? Or do you want to tell me that you're the hero of Zhongzhou State, and I dare not kill you? Li Tianlan's voice was cold without any warmth, and he said resolutely, "Treason. Huh, I'll say it here today. The lives of more than 1,000 soldiers must be paid with blood. No one can stop me. If I really leave Zhongzhou State because of this, it's not me who betrayed Zhongzhou State, but Zhongzhou State betrayed me." He looked at the lieutenant general in front of him, or, to be exact, at the miniature camera on the lieutenant general's collar. "I won't stop until I die. Are you ready?" He grabbed a corner of his cloak with his hand and suddenly pulled it. In an instant, An unimaginably bright sword light appeared over the desert. With Li Tianlan as the center, the sword light quickly stretched out in the night sky. A rainbow appeared under the night sky of the desert. The colorful rainbow crossed the desert in an instant and appeared at the missile base 200 kilometers away. The sword light was like a rainbow. Fast. It was incredibly fast. The extremely bright light exploded in the center of the missile base almost as soon as Li Tianlan raised his palm. There was a loud bang. The earth shook and the mountains shook. It was deafening. The raging fire suddenly enveloped everything. The entire base exploded from the ground to the ground. The strong fire swept everything in the base, the buildings, the turf, the garden, the vehicles, and the soldiers. Everything was completely shattered in the explosion. The mushroom cloud rose into the night sky. The violent explosion affected the nearby cities, and the whole city was shaking slightly. Li Tianlan put down his palm. The rainbow disappeared. A black windbreaker reappeared on Li Tianlan's body. "What did you do?" "You." The lieutenant general's face was pale. The almost earth-shattering explosion could be vaguely heard even here. He finally couldn't help but take a step back. Li Tianlan crooked his finger. A special encrypted mobile phone flew out of the lieutenant general's pocket. Li Tianlan picked up the phone, lowered his head, and dialed a number. The phone was quickly connected, and a cold voice sounded. "This is Dong Xingwudi. Minister, it's me," Li Tianlan said. On the military plane, Dong Xingwudi froze for a moment and looked at the display. "Tianlan, is Qian Guoqiang with you?" Li Tianlan didn't know who Qian Guoqiang was, but it must be the name of the lieutenant general in front of him. He said slowly, "I have a request for the aftermath of the war in the desert." "Go ahead," Dong Xingwudi said calmly. "Every soldier who died in the battle in Emperor Dong's palace should become a martyr recognized by Zhongzhou State." Li Tianlan said calmly. "No problem," Dong Xingwudi answered without hesitation. Li Tianlan was silent for a moment and said again, "You didn't understand what I meant." Dong Xingwudi hummed and seemed to be confused. Then he fell silent. He might not understand at first, but after Li Tianlan emphasized it again, he naturally understood. The victims of Emperor Dong's palace should become martyrs of Zhongzhou State. The tens of thousands of Beijing soldiers who died in the desert could not be regarded as martyrs. If this matter was determined in this way, it was self-evident what it meant. They deserve it, Li Tianlan said lightly. This was what he said from the bottom of his heart. Maybe those people were right. But Li Tianlan couldn't stand in the shoes of others to consider the problem. He had his own standpoint, and from his standpoint, those people deserved it. "I see." Dong Xingwudi was silent for a long time before he said in a low voice, "Wait for me in the desert. I'm already on my way." Li Tianlan said no more and silently hung up the phone. The mobile phone in his hand silently turned into extremely tiny pieces. Li Tianlan looked up at the lieutenant general who had just swaggered in front of him, narrowed his eyes, and whispered, "Do you have any last words?" Chapter 878. The lieutenant general couldn't help but take another step back. He stared at Li Tianlan in front of him and observed his expression. Li Tianlan's expression was calm and casual, but the faint killing intent in his eyes seemed to be real. He was serious. The lieutenant general finally confirmed this. "You must be responsible for your actions." The lieutenant general forced himself to calm down. He looked at Li Tianlan and said in a suppressed voice, 200 kilometers away, the Skybird missile gone." Li Tianlan said lightly, "The so-called missile base you mentioned is gone." The lieutenant general thought of the voice he had vaguely heard before, and his face became more and more gloomy. He shook his head fiercely. "It's impossible." Li Tianlan looked at him and nodded after a moment of silence. "It's a little boring." He looked at the miniature camera on the lieutenant general's collar. "I don't know what you want to do by filming this idiot, but I appreciate your approach. I hope you send more people to die. One lieutenant general is not enough." The subtle light on the desert floated slowly and fell on the lieutenant general. In an instant, A large amount of blood sprayed out of the lieutenant general's body, as if there were countless tiny but extremely sharp, long swords piercing his body. His body became a fountain from head to toe, spraying blood all over his body. The extremely distorted and miserable wails suddenly rang out. The voice was desperate and frightened to the extreme. Scarlet blood splashed into the air, reflecting an extremely strange color under the reflection of the sword light. It was a beautiful scene. Li Beitian, who was standing beside Li Tianlan, looked at the scene and listened to the lieutenant general scream. His body trembled subconsciously. The lieutenant general's body fell to the ground, screaming at the top of his lungs. Countless tiny light spots covered his whole body, and a large amount of blood dyed the desert under him red at a speed visible to the naked eye. The light surged on him at a steady pace, and his body seemed to be getting smaller and smaller. Li Tianlan didn't move and looked at him coldly. The lieutenant general's screams grew weaker and weaker. Every speck of light on his body was a sharp sword. Tens of thousands of swords shuttled through his body, grinding against each other and melting his flesh, bringing him the greatest pain in the tiniest of places. His body gradually disappeared. More than 10 minutes later, the lieutenant general had completely lost all traces of its existence. His military uniform, medals, and body had all disappeared, leaving only a pool of blood on the ground. Li Tianlan turned back to sort out the corpses and muttered to himself, "A Beijiang military region is not enough. One lieutenant general was not enough. An invincible realm expert was not enough. The Beijiang military region was not enough." Li Tianlan said he wanted revenge. All of his hatred, all of his cruel methods, seemed to point towards a single target. Li Beitian took a deep breath and lifted a corpse with Li Tianlan. He suddenly said, "Chen Fanqing. One Chen Fanqing is not enough." Li Tianlan lowered his head. His life can't compare to more than 1,000 elites of Emperor Dong's palace. So, Li Beitian's scalp went numb. One prince group is enough. Li Tianlan smiled. His tone was still calm, but the content of his words could be said to be earth-shattering. Li Beitian took a deep breath and finally understood what Li Tianlan wanted to do. The blockade of Beijiang military region was a war initiated by Chen Fanqing against Emperor Dong's palace. And now Li Tianlan wanted more than just revenge. What he returned to Chen Fanqing was also a war that was crazy enough to involve the entire Zhongzhou state. But now, Li Beitian hesitated for a moment. "Isn't it too early?" "It's not early," Li Tianlan said. "The opportunity is here. I have enough strength." His strength was enough. Now the opportunity was also here. Li Tianlan was sure that he was invincible now. He might not be able to fight against the whole world alone as Wang Tianzong did in Eastern Europe. But now if he wanted to kill someone, he didn't think anyone in the dark world could escape. He already had the strength to stand at the peak of an individual. Xinyuan City was developing rapidly and thriving. All kinds of resources were gradually perfected. The huge capital flow was endless, and all aspects of the system were constantly being optimized. When he officially set foot in Xinyuan City, that was the time when Emperor Dong's palace started to integrate Tiannan. Simply put, he also had the foundation of a superpower. The giant group had been reshuffling in the past 2 years. The total scale of the group had shrunk a lot, but it was more cohesive. At critical moments, it could make the same voice. Li Tianlan was sure that this voice would support him, so he also had the absolutely reliable, strong support. It didn't matter whether the identity of military counselor was exposed or not. The key was the saber in his hand. That saber belonged to Samsara Palace. Now Li Tianlan had the strength to hold that saber. He also had some surviving elders of the Li family. The strength he had now was enough to support a new group. The differences among the upper echelons of Zhongzhou State became more and more intense. Li Huacheng gradually became conservative. Chen Fanqing was stubborn. Gu Xingyun was seriously injured, and with the death of Gu Qianchuan, the Special Warfare Group was in a panic. Under such circumstances, the Southeast Group could not let go of the Prince Group, and the giant group fully supported Li Tianlan. With such a good opportunity, Li Tianlan thought that he could try to shake and even destroy the foundation of the entire prince group. He was sure. In the next few decades, he might not have such a good opportunity again. Time passed slowly. All the corpses of the dead in Emperor Dong's palace were gradually sorted out. Wen Bai Yuming, who was in charge of the middle part of the battlefield, came to Li Tianlan's side. The roar of the helicopter rotors sounded at the same time. In the distant night, a dense group of helicopters gradually approached and began to gradually descend from a very far place. 10, 20, 30, 2 squadrons of helicopters slowly landed in the desert. The door of the leading helicopter was pulled open. Dong Chengwudi, the minister of the army headquarters, took the lead to come out. Bai Qingzhao followed him. Beside Bai Qingzhao, there was a serious general in a military uniform next to him. Li Tianlan walked over, thought about it, and still did not salute. He was no longer the marshal of Zhongzhou State and had nothing to do with the military on the surface. Minister, he took the initiative to reach out and hold Dong Chengwudi's palm. It's good that you're okay. It's good that you're okay. Dong Chengwudi held Li Tianlan's palm tightly and said, "Come on, let me introduce you. This is Commander He Donglai of the Air Force, my old friend." Li Tianlan looked at the helicopter with the Suzhou logo on the desert and reached out to shake He Donglai's hand. "Thank you, Commander He." He Donglai, who was silent and looked a little serious, suddenly smiled and said in a low voice, "It seems that I don't have to go to the desert prison." Li Tianlan was a little stunned. Dong Chengwudi smiled, but his eyes were a little cold. Beijiang blocked the way of contact with the Air Force. When they sent out the ambition team, Donglai was ready to transfer people from Suzhou to snipe the Air Force of the Beijiang military region. If it weren't for you, the scene in the desert would be much more lively now. Li Tianlan took a deep breath, held He Donglai's broad palm, and said seriously, "Commander He, I will remember this favor." He Donglai shook his head and did not speak. Behind him, the surviving members of Emperor Dong's palace were gradually gathering. Li Tianlan said hello to Bai Qingzhao, turned around, and waved to the people of Emperor Dong's palace. The survivors carried the bodies of the victims to the helicopters. Except for the leading helicopter, all the other helicopters only had pilots and co-pilots, and the cabins were all empty. The corpses were carried up one by one. When all the helicopters were full, there were still half of the corpses left. 2 squadrons of helicopters slowly took off and returned to Suzhou. As soon as the first batch of helicopters rose, the second batch of helicopters landed again. Li Tianlan watched this scene quietly. He watched the corpses being carried to the helicopters without saying a word. No one knew what he was thinking. "Come back to Yuzhou with me." Dong Chengwudi stood beside Li Tianlan and suddenly said. His voice was steady. It was not an order. It was not a discussion. It was an attitude. It came from the attitude of the army headquarters of Zhongzhou State. From a second he said this, Li Tianlan was no longer a prisoner of the desert prison. Dong Chengwudi showed up here as soon as possible to express this attitude. At least from this point of view, he could stop others from talking. Li Tianlan nodded and watched the second batch of helicopters slowly disappear into the night. The distant night sky lit up again. When all the corpses were transported to Suzhou, the third batch of helicopters landed in the desert again. All the survivors of Emperor Dong's palace gathered silently in front of the helicopters. Li Tianlan took a deep breath and walked over. Everyone was looking at Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan was also looking at them. The faces in his line of sight were filled with exhaustion, weakness, anger, and sorrow. But they were not confused, nor did they flinch. It was not until this moment that Li Tianlan was finally sure that this war that caused heavy losses to Emperor Dong's palace also made the most direct transformation of the Nightmare Army. There were only 300 elites who fought their way out of the army of 100,000. And these 300 people in front of him were destined to become the strongest cornerstone of Emperor Dong's palace in the future. "Thank you." Li Tianlan looked at every face in front of him and said softly, "Thank you for everything you have done in this war." There was a slight commotion in the crowd, but no one spoke. Li Tianlan smiled and continued, "This war is not meaningless. We have suffered heavy losses, but we have not failed." The Nightmare Army with less than 2,000 people passed through the defense line of nearly 100,000 troops. Maybe we don't have to wait until tomorrow. Maybe now, the whole dark world knows the name of the Nightmare Army and the dignity and bottom line of Emperor Dong's palace. All of this is protected by your lives. You should be remembered by this era. This is our era. Everyone who died in the war or lived, everyone is a hero of this era. No matter how glorious Emperor Dong's palace will be in the future, everyone in this era will remember that when we were weak at the beginning, it was you who forged the pride and dignity of Emperor Dong's palace with your blood and life. Li Tianlan looked deeply at the crowd in front of him and said, "I will give you an explanation. Wait for me in Tian'an." He nodded to Li Beitian and said calmly, "Now, get on the plane and go back." Everyone turned around at the same time and silently walked into the helicopters one after another. Lin Fengting walked to Li Tianlan and said with a smile, "I'll go to Tian'an too." Li Tianlan glanced at him and nodded. "Okay." Lin Fengting nodded with a smile and followed the elites of Emperor Dong's palace without saying goodbye to Dongsheng Wudi. The helicopters slowly took off. The faint light illuminated the desert. Li Tianlan stood in the light and watched the helicopters get higher and farther away. He was silent for a long time. Dongsheng Wudi looked at the scene quietly, with a complicated look in his eyes. He thought of the sword light that tore the sky and the earth, the silent but firm eyes of the Nightmare Army before they left, and the messy battlefield the helicopters flew all the way. He finally realized something. In this magnificent era, tonight, Emperor Dong's palace officially took its first step. Countless glory and splendor were ahead. They were all on the way to Emperor Dong's palace. Just as Li Tianlan had said, this was their era. Chapter 879. When Chun Fangqing walked into Li Huaqing's office, Li Huaqing had just turned off the video in the office, cut off the satellite signal, and was going to rest. Recently, Zhongzhou's state had been troubled. The exposure of the termination plan had caused too many chain reactions, and the action of blocking the desert had pushed everything to the point of no return. Li Huaqing's heart was always tense, waiting for a result. As a result, the Nightmare Legion suffered heavy losses. Tens of thousands of troops in Beijiang were buried with the result of almost being wiped out. At the same time, Li Tianlan's earth-shattering sword came. It was hard to say whether this result was what Li Huaqing wanted, but whether he wanted it or not, at least it was a result that could not be changed. Li Huaqing's heart relaxed. The exhaustion all over his body made him appear muddle-headed. He drank the tasteless strong tea in front of him, stood up, and reached out to turn off the desk lamp in front of the desk. "President." A middle-aged secretary walked over with a respectful expression. Li Huaqing glanced at him. The secretary looked at the tired Li Huaqing, hesitated, and told the truth. "The Prime Minister is outside." Li Huaqing was silent for a while, took out a cigarette, lit it, took a deep breath, and said, "Invite him in." The desk lamp was turned off. He turned on the light in the office, poured himself a glass of water, and sat on the sofa in silence. In the sound of heavy footsteps, Chun Fangqing walked in slowly. He seemed to feel that there was no need to hide anything. His calm face looked a little gloomy. Li Huaqing held the cigarette and said nothing. Chun Fangqing sat opposite Li Huaqing and also said nothing. A cigarette slowly burned out. Li Huaqing picked up the teacup and drank some water. He looked at Chun Fangqing, who still had no intention of speaking, and said flatly, "Obviously, your plan failed." Chun Fangqing suddenly clenched his fists. The news just came that the airborne bird missile base in Beijiang was destroyed. All the weapons, equipment, base construction, and more than 300 soldiers and some researchers in the base all died. Chun Fangqing said each word, gritting his teeth. "So?" Li Huaqing was calm. Chun Fangqing suddenly broke out. He jumped up and roared, "He's committing treason. He is the enemy of Zhongzhou's state, and he is provoking its dignity. Ambition team, Fierce Tiger Armored Corps, Airborne Bird Missile Base, the 43rd Army, Guqianchuan. These are all Li Tianlan's responsibility. He didn't care about Zhongzhou State at all. He only cared about himself and Emperor Dong's palace. He dares to do this now. What about 10 years later? If he dares to do this now, will he? If he really became the so-called Heavenly Son, would Zhongzhou State become his slaughterhouse? If he really becomes the so-called son of Li Huacheng will said. Li Huacheng rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache coming on. What do you mean by that? I Tianlan, Li Fun, Li Tianlan, I said. Back. Chun Fanqing said seriously. He has almost no scruples in doing things. If he continues to grow, he will be even more dangerous than the Wang family of Beihai. Such a person must not be left alive. I suggest that we immediately recall Minister Dongqing Wudi and kill him in the desert at all costs. You can do that. Li Huaqing quietly looked at Chun Fanqing. After a long time, he nodded. You can do it now. In fact, you've already done it, but you didn't succeed. I don't deny my failure. Chun Fanqing also lit a cigarette and took a big drag. But it is because of this failure that we can see Li Tianlan's true colors. I need your support. Impossible. Without any hesitation, Li Huacheng said decisively. Looking at Chun Fanqing's ugly expression, he took a deep breath and said in a low voice, I support you? If I support you now, I will start a civil war. Prime Minister, you should calm down. Don't you think it's messy enough? Chun Fanqing was silent for a while and seemed to be thinking about the wording. When he was about to speak, Li Huacheng continued, You can't convince me. No matter what the reason is, Prime Minister, our cooperation is not like this. I still say that I can understand your behavior, but I don't agree with your approach. There are many possibilities for Zhongzhou State in the future, but if I agree to support you now, it will be a disaster for Zhongzhou State now. I personally think that you should stop this series of actions. How to deal with the aftermath is the most important thing you should consider. Chun Fanqing suddenly stood up with a livid face. Li Huacheng lowered his head quietly and drank some water. Chun Fanqing said no more and left the president's office without saying a word. The secretary, who was already past work time, respectfully sent Chun Fanqing out. Looking at the direction he left, the secretary frowned slightly and returned to the president's office. President. The secretary glanced at Li Huacheng and stopped talking. Say it. Li Huacheng smiled. The prime minister seems to have gone to Tian'an Pavilion. The secretary said softly. The location of Tian'an Pavilion in the Hidden Dragon Sea and Chun Fanqing's residence was the opposite. There was also a director of Zhongzhou State, Zhou Yinhai, the leader of the North Group, living there. Li Huacheng narrowed his eyes and shook his head. It doesn't make sense. He stood up and looked at the secretary with a smile. Let's go. Work is over. Let's go eat something together. Oh, by the way, inform Minister Dongcheng. Li Huacheng stopped and said, when they return to Yuzhou, ask them to come over. The last batch of helicopters completely disappeared into the night sky. In the desert, Dongqing Wudi hung up the phone with a calm expression and let out a long breath. Li Tianlan still stood there, looking at the direction where the helicopters left. Let's go. Dongqing Wudi took 2 steps forward and reached out to pat Li Tianlan on the shoulder. I just received a call from the president's office. The president wants to see you. There should be a conclusion to this matter. Li Tianlan knew what the so-called conclusion was without thinking. He nodded and said thoughtfully, he is smarter than Chun Fanqing. That's a good thing. Dongqing Wudi said seriously. Indeed. Li Tianlan nodded. Let's go. Dongqing Wudi waved his hand, and the rotors of the helicopter beside him began to turn slowly. Li Tianlan looked back in the direction of the prison and gently raised his hand. A stream of sword energy spread from his hand, and his figure disappeared in an instant. At the same time, in the desert prison, the flower of sword energy inserted in Qin Weibai's hair suddenly trembled. The flower, which looked lifeless, was almost full of vitality and color in an instant. Qin Weibai thoughtfully took off the flower on her head. The crystal-clear flower was trembling gently, and the flower branches and petals seemed to be in full bloom at this moment. The lifelike petals bloomed to the limit in the blink of an eye. The flower condensed by sword energy was broken in Qin Weibai's white and tender palm. Li Tianlan appeared beside Qin Weibai. Qin Weibai blinked. Before she could react, she was directly carried by Li Tianlan. "Let's go." He lowered his head and sniffed the delicate fragrance close at hand, and his whole body relaxed slightly. "Where to?" Qin Weibai reached out and obediently put her arms around Li Tianlan's neck and asked softly, "Get out of here." Li Tianlan's voice was firm. "To see our country." Chapter 880. The living room of the warmly and luxuriously decorated villa shone with all kinds of lights and shadows. The lights in the living room were dimmed. On the huge projection screen that almost occupied the entire wall, all kinds of pictures kept flickering. Yellow sand fluttered in the air. An explosion of raging flames. Domineering sword light. His Majesty sat on the sofa and watched these pictures. He had been silent for a long time. Jiang Wuchu sat on the sofa on the other side with a solemn face. From time to time, he glanced in the direction of His Majesty with undisguised curiosity. On the screen was the picture of the Desert War. From beginning to end, it sounded like nothing, but in fact it was shocking enough. The Jiang family of South America naturally had its own information channels in Zhongzhou State. Not only the Jiang family of South America, but also Jifeng's sword training school in East Island had its own pawns that had been operating for many years. But unsurprisingly, they couldn't get any video images about the Desert War at all. It was said that those who were qualified to pay attention to the Desert War could be regarded as leaders of Zhongzhou State. In terms of authority, they had reached the level of Zhongzhou State councilors. Under normal circumstances, it was impossible for countries and forces in the world to cultivate their pawns to such a level. But His Majesty could directly watch everything about the Desert War, including all the details. What did this mean? And this kind of watching was not the video that was obtained afterward. The picture on the screen was a little delayed, but there was no doubt that it was a real live broadcast. This also meant that His Majesty had at least one counselor's connections in Zhongzhou State, and he had enough influence to let this counselor bear all the risks for him. For the Jiang family of South America, this news was even more important than the shocking sword stroke in the video. "Your Majesty," Moraid suddenly called out. In the middle of the sofa, His Majesty gave a faint and watched the sword stroke in the video over and over again. The Desert War was over, but he kept playing the picture of that moment over and over again. "What should we do now?" Moraid's tone was a little hesitant. The operation of the alliance of several forces to infiltrate Beihai had reached the final stage. The final battle was imminent, and the whole dark world was waiting for the result. But now Li Tianlan left the desert directly. The minister of the army headquarters personally took him back to Yuzhou. This attitude could not be more obvious. What was worse was that Li Tianlan might have stood by and watched the game between Zhongzhou State and Beihai, but after the blockade, Li Tianlan and Beihai would definitely join hands. Whether it was the termination plan, the blockade action, or the large number of elites of the Nightmare Troop who died in the desert, Li Tianlan and Chun Fanqing were destined to be irreconcilable enemies. This kind of personal grudge was magnified countless times at the most critical moment. Not to mention how Li Tianlan would retaliate against Chun Fanqing. At least now the more Chun Fanqing wanted to do something, the less likely Li Tianlan would let him do it. The 100,000-strong army moved majestically, but the blockade did not last more than 2 days. They expected the blockade to last at least half a month. The time difference meant too many things. Moray didn't know whether to say that the Beijiang military region was incompetent or that Emperor Dong's palace was too strong. In short, the result was there. Emperor Dong's palace, which had suffered heavy losses, had found its real core. In the next decisive battle in North Sea, they would also face Li Tianlan and even face that sword. Moray couldn't block that sword. He didn't want to find any reason or excuse, and there was no need. He really couldn't block it. He was now only half a step away from the peak of the invincible realm. Even if he could take this half a step in this period of time and become a real expert at the peak of the invincible realm, he still couldn't block that sword. Even if he had the Pope's coronation, even if he was really at the peak of the invincible realm, Gu Qianchuan's death was still vivid in his mind. Morade could be sure that at that moment, no matter if it was Gu Qianchuan or other experts at the peak of the invincible realm, as long as they stood in that position and faced that sword light, there would be no possibility of survival. Are you afraid? His Majesty lowered his head, looked at the sword light shuttling in the screen, and chuckled. The video had been played in slow motion, but the sword light on the screen was still like wind and lightning, insufferably arrogant. I can't block this sword strike, Morade said seriously. He was talking about the sword strike on the screen. The power of this sword strike was not as good as the eternal sword strike that injured the Chosen One in Eastern Europe. It was also not as good as the sword strike that the unidentified Chosen One made against Mount Dibbing about a year ago. But in terms of scene, this sword strike could be said to be the most gorgeous. This sword flew thousands of miles, rushed through mountains, rivers, and seas, tore up the ambitious team, the steel torrent, and tens of thousands of troops. After its power continued to weaken, it still killed Gu Qianchuan, who was holding a murderous weapon, in a flash. It could still kill someone at the peak of the invincible realm. Morade couldn't block this sword strike from a distance. If it was a sword strike at a close distance, he couldn't block it. If you can't block it, then you can't block it. You don't need to block it. His Majesty's voice was gentle. And the state of this sword is a bit special. It can be regarded as a murderous weapon. Its power will only get weaker and weaker. It is not as terrible as you think. At this stage, in my opinion, Li Tianlan is the most terrible. Morade wanted to say something, but stopped on second thought. His Majesty seemed to know what he wanted to ask. He glanced at him and said quietly, "The final battle will continue. If this sword strike really appears on the battlefield, I will deal with it." His tone was flat and casual. Thinking of His Majesty's strange domain, Morade calmed down slightly. His Majesty's finger gently slid across the screen, and the sword strike was played back again, tearing apart heaven and earth, moving forward with indomitable will. His Majesty's eyes were fixed on the sword light. The curve of his mouth was still there, but his eyes were full of disgust. Little by little, the pain that seemed to come from the depths of his memory gradually spread all over his body. His body trembled subconsciously, as if there were countless sword energy penetrating his body. The vague clouds and starlight shrouded him. He closed his eyes, smiled a little ferociously, and murmured, "Wuqing, it's been a long time." The sword light was reflected in the eyes of many people. His Majesty watched it again. Wang Xingxiao was also watching it. For anyone who aspired to the end of martial arts, that sword light could be regarded as the most beautiful scenery in the world. His Majesty's eyes were full of disgust, but Wang Xingxiao's eyes were full of appreciation. That kind of look was not surprise or shock, but pure appreciation. It was undisguised, unreserved, and with a little excitement. Phoenix sat next to him and could clearly see the emotions in her nephew's eyes. To be exact, it was as if he was looking at something that belonged to him and expressing his joy. "You want that sword?" Phoenix said slowly. It was not a question. It was a statement without any emotional ups and downs. "That was my sword in the first place." Wang Xingxiao turned to look at her and said with a soft smile, "Or it is the sword of the Wang family of Beihai, the invincible sword in the world, strong beyond imagination." When did the sword of the Wang family of Beihai recognize an outsider as its master? Phoenix's voice was a little sarcastic. Wang Xingxiao didn't care. He seemed to have adapted to this aunt's cynicism toward the Wang family of Beihai. He looked at the screen quietly and said calmly, "It doesn't matter. What matters is that it will return to the Wang family of Beihai and become the foundation of the Wang family of Beihai's continued glory." "You are no match for Li Tianlan," Phoenix said calmly. "Far from it. You should know this yourself, so you want to take the sword. Where does your confidence come from?" "I'm not taking the sword." Wang Shengxiao shook his head, and his voice was a little stubborn. That is the sword of the Wang family of Beihai. Now it should just go home. Li Tianlan won't think so. If the invincible sword really goes to Beihai, do you think Li Tianlan will let you go? Phoenix sneered. Does Li Tianlan's attitude matter? What matters is that I have the right to take back what belongs to the Wang family of Beihai. Wang Shengxiao's voice was a little cold. He looked at the sword light on the screen and narrowed his eyes tightly. With this sword, I can sweep the world. What can Li Tianlan do if he is not satisfied? You are courting death. Phoenix sat up straight and said seriously. Don't worry. Wang Shengxiao laughed. Aunt Li Tianlan is not an enemy. The ownership of Xianyuan Feng is not decided by Li Tianlan, nor by me. Its only result is to become a divine weapon of the Wang family of Beihai. As for Emperor Dong's palace, we will give enough compensation. What kind of compensation do you think can satisfy Li Tianlan's appetite? Phoenix shook her head. Wang Shengxiao was silent for a while, and then said quietly, a group. He paused and continued, a supergroup that can compete with the Southeast group. Chapter 881. It was snowing all over Yuzhou. The heavy snow had been falling from last night to nearly noon, and it had become an extremely rare snowstorm in Yuzhou in recent years. Li Tianlan stood in front of the French window in his bedroom, looking down at the large urban area. He looked casual and comfortable. The room was as warm as spring. Outside the window, it was snowing heavily. The wild snowstorm covered every street and every building in sight. The whole world was pale and quiet. The scene was extremely quiet, but also extremely vivid. Li Tianlan closed his eyes subconsciously. He had returned to Yuzhou last night, but he did not go to Prince Yang's mansion or the Bai family's manor. Instead, he chose a hotel on Chang'an Street. It was not that he treated Dongqing Wudi as an outsider. Prince Yang's mansion was originally his and Dongqing Rushi's wedding house. The Bai family chose the site, and the Dongqing family paid for it. But now Dongqing Rushi was unconscious in Tianan. If he lived there with Qin Weibai, he always felt that it was a little inappropriate. It was even more inappropriate to live in the Bai family. Qin Weibai also had a property in Yuzhou, but no one had cleaned it for a long time. In addition, Li Tianlan was going to the Hidden Dragon Sea today, so he simply found a hotel nearby to stay. From Beijiang to Yuzhou, it was thousands of miles away in one night. It seemed very unusual, but for Li Tianlan, it was a completely different world. In the desert, he was pure and quiet. He didn't need to think too much about anything. The only thing he needed to pursue was his own swordsmanship. And in Yuzhou, he was the palace lord of Emperor Dong's palace, the Emperor Dong of the Dark World. The Desert War had ended. The Beijiang military region and Emperor Dong's palace had tasted the bitter fruit that they didn't want to taste at all. The cruel reality was in front of him. Li Tianlan could already control his emotions, but he seemed to be still immersed in the state of raising swords in the desert, so that he still felt a little uncomfortable when he came to Yuzhou from the desert. He found it difficult to adapt to his current perspective of the world. It was an indescribable feeling. During Li Tianlan's 2 years in the desert, there had always been rumors in the Dark World that he was the #1 expert in the Dark World after Lin Fengting. Li Tianlan knew this. He wasn't sure if he felt pressure or how much pressure he felt, but it was undeniable that he had been making progress in the past 2 years. When he was about to break through the invincible realm, his progress in all aspects was limited to a certain height because of his body. Moreover, because he hadn't fought with anyone, he couldn't even tell how much he had improved. That year, Li Tianlan was less than 25 years old. It was really difficult for his body to support him officially entering the domain of the invincible realm. Therefore, in the process of nurturing the sword, he chose another direction of martial arts. Therefore, all the progress of the last 2 years has been completely and utterly unrestrained in a most perfect way. Show it. The muddle-headed Li Tianlan didn't feel anything. However, when Xianyuan Feng entered the desert, when he became completely clear-minded and restrained his killing intent for the time being, when he returned to Yuzhou province and completely recovered his composure, he finally realized that something was different. The world might not have changed, but his perspective had changed. It was a kind of change that he had never thought of before. To be exact, it was a perspective of truly standing at the peak of personal strength in the dark world. Everything in sight. Snow filled the sky, skyscrapers, dense streets, surging traffic, and a boundless world. All of this became extremely fragile in his eyes. It was so fragile that he could easily destroy everything with a flick of his finger. This feeling made Li Tianlan feel novel and scared. He had almost been suppressing his desire to destroy and fight, so that he could control himself to stand here quietly. The flying snowflakes hit the French windows, making a soft sound. The breeze blew through the falling snow, and all the sounds seemed to be infinitely magnified. His perception was almost extremely sharp. Li Tianlan shook his head hard, turned around, and quietly closed the curtains. On the bed, Qin Weibai gently turned over, made a lazy sound, and opened her eyes. "Why are you awake?" Li Tianlan sat on the edge of the bed and touched her hair. Qin Weibai shook her head and rolled her eyes at Li Tianlan. Her eyes were a little hazy and blurred. The pair of eyes that seemed to be always cold and indifferent were soft, enchanting, and captivating. She wrapped herself in a snow-white velvet quilt, put her white and tender arms on Li Tianlan's palm, and whispered, "Hug me." Li Tianlan took off his pajamas, got back into the quilt, and hugged the soft and light body beside him. Qin Weibai rubbed her face against Li Tianlan's chest and murmured, "I dreamed." "What dream?" Li Tianlan reached out and gently pinched Qin Weibai's ear and asked casually. A natural and rich fragrance filled the room. His body was so relaxed that he didn't even bother to move for a while. "I dreamed that you dumped me and told me to get out. You said you never wanted to see me again." Qin Weibai subconsciously hugged Li Tianlan, as if still immersed in the dream. Her voice was a little aggrieved and pitiful. "Ridiculous." Li Tianlan's palm made a crisp sound in the white velvet quilt. He didn't promise anything, but just laughed and scolded. "Am I a fool in your dream?" "Who knows?" Qin Weibai gently bit Li Tianlan. "Maybe I'm tired of playing." Li Tianlan sneered and looked down at Qin Weibai's cold and resentful face with a special blush. "I think you don't want to get out of bed today. Don't." Qin Weibai screamed and seemed to wake up completely. She put one hand against Li Tianlan's chest and grabbed her clothes in a panic with the other hand. "I want to take a shower. I have an appointment today." "I can't." Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows and was about to say something when his phone suddenly rang. The phone is ringing. "Answer the phone, be good." Qin Weibai pushed Li Tianlan and said in a soft voice. Li Tianlan shook his head and took the phone. For a moment, the soft peaks and the warm valley were far away from him. Qin Weibai put on her bathrobe, glared at Li Tianlan, and walked into the bathroom. Li Tianlan was a little annoyed. When he picked up the phone and heard the voice, his eyes became even colder. The voice on the other side of the phone was respectful, and it could even be said to be in fear and trepidation. "Hello, Your Highness Li Tianlan. I'm Little Yuan from the Cabinet Office." Just by listening to the voice, Li Tianlan could imagine the cautious picture on the other end of the phone. Li Tianlan smiled and said lightly, "Do I know you?" This sentence was direct and domineering, leaving no face for the other party. The Cabinet Office of Zhongzhou State. In terms of rank, this was a real governor-level agency. The so-called Little Yuan was not young at all, whether in age or rank. Although he was not the chief of the general office, he was the first deputy. His real job was the chief secretary of Chun Fanqing. In Zhongzhou State, he was definitely a sensitive and powerful figure. The other end of the phone did not speak for a long time, not knowing whether it was because of anger or fear. Li Tianlan did not bother to pay attention to it, and hung up the phone. He looked at his watch, listened to the sound of running water in the bathroom, and slowly put on his clothes. The door of the bathroom was locked. Li Tianlan pushed it, but it did not open. "What?" Qin Weibai's fierce voice sounded, but it sounded without confidence. I'm going to Hidden Dragon's Sea, Li Tianlan said. The sound of running water in the bathroom was a little lower. Qin Weibai said, I won't check out the room. I'll live here for the time being. What do you want to eat at noon? Whatever, Li Tianlan said indifferently. I may not come back at noon, or I'll have lunch with the minister. I'll come back to pick you up then. Qin Weibai said. The door of the bathroom was gently pulled open. Qin Weibai's dreamy face was exposed because of the water vapor. She looked at Li Tianlan and said seriously, Li Huaqing's conditions won't be low, but his bottom line won't be too high either. Stick to what you should. I know. Li Tianlan pinched her little nose and turned to go out. The phone rang again when he closed the door. It was still the same number. Li Tianlan thought about it and pressed the answer button. Your Highness Li Tianlan, I'm Yuan Shi from the Cabinet Office of Zhongzhou State. Here's the thing. The Prime Minister has something to talk to you alone. It's 10:20 in the morning. The Prime Minister has half an hour. Please don't be late. The voice on the phone, which had been cautious not long ago, became righteous, but it was a little trembling. Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth and said coldly, I don't have time. Let him wait. Chapter 882. Ma Si sat quietly in the lobby of the hotel and looked down at his watch for time. He casually responded to the flattery of the hotel general manager with a nervous expression. The hotel had been cordoned off an hour ago. The lobby was quiet and seemed a little cold. A few essential staff members stood carefully at their posts, occasionally sneaking glances at their boss. They didn't know Ma Si, but looking at the cautious attitude of their boss, even a fool knew that this seemingly strange middle-aged man was absolutely a big shot. However, such a big shot would also wait for someone, and he had been waiting for nearly half an hour, which made everyone curious. The hotel general manager, who had been carefully accompanying Ma Si, was even more curious. He was curious and a little afraid. Yuzhou was full of high-ranking officials and people with great power. Ma Si's rank was far from the highest in Yuzhou, but looking at the whole Zhongzhou state, there were few people who were qualified to make Ma Si wait here without any temper. The first deputy director of the Zhongzhou State Office of Public Affairs. With this identity, there was no need to say anything at all. It was not the Zhongzhou State Cabinet Office of Public Affairs, nor the Zhongzhou State Army Headquarters Office. It was simply the Zhongzhou State Office of Public Affairs, an institution at the level of a counselor. The so-called first deputy director could be said to be the first secretary of Zhongzhou State. How many people in the whole Zhongzhou State were qualified to make him wait here? The first secretary of the president. The hotel general manager had carefully recalled many times, but he couldn't remember which immortal came to his hotel. Director Ma, do you need to rush him? You're so busy every day, so the boss smiled and was careful. He naturally knew that the person who could make Ma Si wait here must have a powerful background, but at least he should express his attitude. Ma Si's nervous face eased a little, and he shook his head with a smile. No, I'll be here soon. He looked down at his watch again. It was 9:40. He shook his head and gave a wry smile. It had been more than 40 minutes since the meeting time, and he hadn't even received the person. The president was also self-restrained, and he hadn't rushed him until now. The boss nodded and said with a smile, Recently, the shop has launched a new type of black tea, which tastes good. I'll ask someone to send it over, and you can have a taste. Ma Si nodded indifferently. Just as she was about to say something, the elevator door, not far away, slowly opened, and a young man who looked no more than 24 or 25 walked out unhurriedly. Ma Si bounced up like a spring, and a warm and respectful smile appeared on her face. He jogged away from his seat and stretched out his hand from afar. His feet moved like the wind, and his smile became more and more enthusiastic. The CEO stared at this scene with his mouth agape. He subconsciously stood up and didn't know whether he should step forward or not. Ma Si's face was already smiling like a flower. His attitude was even more exaggerated than when he was with the president. Your Highness, hello, I am Ma Si. Ma Si walked quickly to Li Tianlan and stretched out her hands. Li Tianlan shook hands with him casually and said, "Hello, Ma Ting. Sorry to keep you waiting." Not long at all. I just arrived too. It's snowing heavily today, so the road conditions are quite average. Ma Si said insincerely and held Li Tianlan's palm with both hands. Feeling his enthusiasm, Li Tianlan gave him a playful look. Ma Si's smile became more and more respectful, and he even bowed slightly subconsciously. His position might not be at the core, but there was no doubt that he was the person who could see the core clearly. As Li Huaqing's secretary, he knew the cause of a series of things and the process of all things. As for the ending, because it didn't happen, he couldn't speculate, but he already knew his leader's choice. Li Huaqing refused to continue to cooperate with Chen Fangqing. At this point, Chen Fangqing might still want to continue to be crazy, but no one dared to continue to play with him. The situation was imminent. What Li Huaqing wanted to do most now was to stabilize the already precarious situation. Li Huaqing wanted to stabilize the already precarious situation. The suppression of Beihai should be stopped. At the same time, Emperor Dong's palace and Li Tianlan should also make enough compensation to reach a new balance. Balance was compromise. Since there was compromise, there must be sacrifice. Chen Fangqing, who launched the termination plan, blocked the desert prison, and directly caused the death of tens of thousands of people, would naturally become a sacrifice. The whole prince group would even struggle because of this. Now, there was less than a year before the election. At this critical point, the prince group would suffer unprecedented losses, even greater than the loss of Emperor Dong's palace in the desert. The Southeast Group and the Special Warfare Group, who had been holding back their anger, were eyeing covetously. Since the academics compromised, they would not give up the benefits in their hands. As for Ma Si, he naturally hoped that he could get a piece of the cake. He was Li Huaqing's secretary, and his predecessor had been sent to a province in the northwest 2 years ago. It could be said that he was a real border commander. In this election, whether Li Huaqing was re-elected or not, he would generally be sent to a position with real power. Before this election, there would be a huge exchange of interests. His name would definitely appear on the list of the academics, and he would be familiar with Li Tianlan. At that time, whether Li Tianlan would support him or not, as long as Li Tianlan did not object, Ma Si's future would be bright. Ma Si was a little emotional. He looked at Li Tianlan with full awe in his eyes. Today, this young man, who was less than 25 years old, was really important in Zhongzhou State. The Li family, the Tianan Freedom Corps, Sai City, the Giant Group, the Wang family of Beihai, the Lin clan, and even a part of the power of the Purgatory of Heaven capital, all the winds and clouds gathered on Li Tianlan. Ma Si thought of the lieutenant general in the Beijiang military region who died in the hands of Li Tianlan. He thought of what Li Tianlan said to the micro camera before the lieutenant general died. That was a sentence that everyone was destined to never forget. If I really leave Zhongzhou State because of this, it is not that I betrayed Zhongzhou State, but that Zhongzhou State betrayed me. If Zhongzhou State does not betray me, I will not betray Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan might have been reluctant to say this before, but now he had enough qualifications. The combat capability, standing at the peak of individual force, the future that could almost unify the dark world in the future, the thriving Emperor Dong's palace, the dense network of relationships, combining all these, Zhongzhou State had to consider the consequences of losing Li Tianlan. It was not a question of whether it could bear it. It was a question of whether it was willing to bear it. If Emperor Dong's palace and Li Tianlan did not break through the blockade of the desert prison, it might be another story. But now Li Tianlan appeared in Yuzhou. In order to stabilize the new balance, Zhongzhou State must give Li Tianlan an explanation. Even the entire prince group had to give him an explanation. Ma Si's body trembled. Thinking of the coming wind and rain, his scalp was numb, and his whole body was trembling. Don't be nervous. Li Tianlan narrowed his eyes. Let's go now. Don't let the president wait too long. Yes, your highness is right. Ma Si took a deep breath, bent down, and said with a smile, Your highness, please. Li Tianlan nodded and walked in front of him as if it was a matter of course. The boss of the hotel stood there and wanted to go forward, but he did not dare. His body was stiff, and he bent down subconsciously, feeling a little embarrassed. "Your Highness, this is the general manager of the hotel. If you have any requirements, you can tell him." Ma Si introduced him with a smile and a low voice. "Your Highness? What kind of strange title is this?" The boss was at a loss for a moment. Li Tianlan glanced at him and nodded. "My wife likes the red bean cake here very much." "Yes, Your Highness. I'll arrange for it to be delivered to Madam immediately." The CEO nodded subconsciously. Li Tianlan nodded, turned around, and walked out of the hotel lobby. The CEO remained. He bent over until Li Tianlan and Ma Si walked out of the hotel. Then he straightened up a little and wiped the cold sweat on his forehead. He did not know who this highness was, but this person's aura was too sharp. He looked ordinary, but standing in front of him, he almost couldn't breathe. It was not until his figure completely disappeared that the CEO suddenly remembered that because he was too nervous, he did not even introduce himself. It was snowing outside the hotel. Ma Si walked down the stairs of the hotel, took a few quick steps, and personally opened the door of the car with a red flag with a special license plate. Li Tianlan sat inside and looked at the wind and snow outside the window in silence. The hotel was not far from the Hidden Dragon Sea. Ma Si carefully chatted with Li Tianlan for a while and found that Li Tianlan was not in the mood to chat, so he turned on the stereo in the car. Before the music was finished, the car had slowly entered the Hidden Dragon Sea. The Hidden Dragon Sea was covered with silver, but the road had been cleared. The car stopped in front of Jinxiu Pavilion, and Li Tianlan's eyes were fixed on the front door of Jinxiu Pavilion. Li Huaqing was standing there with an easygoing smile and seemed to be enjoying the snow. Whether it was enjoying the snow or something else, he stood here at this time, which could be said to give Li Tianlan enough face. Ma Si quickly opened the door for Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan took a deep breath and walked out of the car. "Tianlan is here." Li Huaqing smiled gently and waved to Li Tianlan. "President." Li Tianlan nodded and looked seriously at the old man who seemed to leave a way out for himself at any time. His voice was a little cold. "President, you are in a good mood." Li Huaqing laughed and walked over with a cigarette. The snow fell on him and dyed him with a faint layer of white. Li Tianlan raised his eyebrows slightly, and a sword intent appeared beside him. As soft as the wind, it swept the white snow on Li Huaqing. "It doesn't matter." Li Huaqing walked to Li Tianlan and took a drag of the cigarette. He looked up at the white snow in the air and said meaningfully, "This snow is very clean." Li Tianlan looked at him quietly and did not speak. "Walk with me." Li Huaqing patted Li Tianlan on the shoulder and stepped forward. "Let's have a casual chat and have lunch together." Li Tianlan followed Li Huaqing and said flatly, "I'm not here to have a casual chat." "Well," Li Huaqing nodded and smiled. "Then what do you want to talk about?" "About Zhongzhou State." Li Tianlan looked at Li Huaqing. "I don't know if I'm qualified." Li Huaqing was silent for a while and said softly, "I remember you said 2 years ago that you are the overall situation of Zhongzhou State." "I said it before I went to the desert." Li Tianlan said flatly, "You said that I would be qualified to say this after I came out. Now I came out, and my view has not changed. From now on, I am the overall situation of Zhongzhou State." So, Li Huaqing's voice was a little vague in the wind and snow. "You're a good president," Li Tianlan said calmly. "Even now, I have no hostility to you. In your position, you're more qualified to say this than me. But you're not the overall situation, but the person who controls the overall situation. You have done a lot of things for Zhongzhou State and indulged a lot of things, such as the Wang family of Beihai and Chun Fangqin. This may be the overall situation in your eyes. But now I'm standing here. In the future, Zhongzhou State should also take me as the most important." His voice paused, and his tone became extremely tough. "This is not a discussion. This is my request. The person who controls the overall situation." Li Huaqing was silent for a long time before he laughed softly. His tone was a little complicated, and the question was extremely sharp. He looked into Li Tianlan's eyes and asked directly, "Can I control you?" Li Tianlan's voice was as calm as water, without any ups and downs. He said something he had said before. "Zhongzhou State does not betray me, and I will not betray Zhongzhou State." Chapter 883. Li Huaqing looked at Li Tianlan thoughtfully, and his eyes were as deep as desire. He had heard this sentence before. Li Tianlan said it in Eastern Europe, and it soon reached his ears. At that time, Li Tianlan said it reluctantly. But now he really had this qualification. That was the problem. It was not a question of whether Li Tianlan could say it or not, but whether he had this qualification. There were many reasons and reasons for love, but it was absolutely impossible to let it down. From an individual standpoint, everyone was very patriotic, but the premise of patriotism was that the country everyone loved had never let him down. Countless policies, constantly promoted reforms, and public opinion propaganda were like rays of light, radiating to all parts of the country. Everyone's life was getting better and better, and the country was getting better and better. This virtuous cycle led to the prosperity of Zhongzhou State today. For the vast majority of Zhongzhou State people, the country might owe something, but it would never let anyone down. Ordinary people were the same. So was Li Tianlan. He now stood at a high place and had the qualification to stand at a high place. Naturally, he also had the qualification to ask Zhongzhou State not to let him down. Whether he betrayed Zhongzhou State or Zhongzhou State betrayed him, when the follow-up effects continued to ferment, it would evolve into a disaster that swept the entire Zhongzhou State. He had too many things. Behind him also represented too many things. Just like what he said himself. From now on, he was the overall situation of Zhongzhou State. Li Huaqing was the president of Zhongzhou State and the most qualified person to represent Zhongzhou State. Li Tianlan repeated this sentence again in front of him, and the meaning was already very obvious. You don't let me down, and I won't let you down. To put it bluntly, you have to support me this time. Li Tianlan's expression did not change at all. The two were less than 2 meters apart. Through the wind and snow, Li Huaqing could clearly feel the other party's fierce and almost tough attitude. It was like flying snow in winter falling on his face with a slight tingling. The Prime Minister is really too impulsive. Li Huaqing was silent for a while and said softly. Li Tianlan turned his head and glanced at him. The other party's voice was very soft, but he knew very well that this was Li Huaqing's official statement. He had this attitude in private, and when he left Hidden Dragon Sea later, Li Huaqing's statement to the outside world would also be the same. The next turmoil in Zhongzhou State would also start from this sentence. This isn't just impulsive, Li Tianlan said flatly. This is a crime. His so-called impulse directly buried the most elite troops of Emperor Dong's palace in the desert, and tens of thousands of soldiers in the Beijiang military region became souls of the dead. For someone as powerful as him, one decision can easily kill tens of thousands of people. Even if he is the prime minister, he can't bear the consequences of this series of consequences. I don't need to pay for his mistakes. What do you want to do? Li Huaqing declined to comment. A debt of blood must be paid with blood. There's nothing much to say. No matter who it is, they must pay the price. Li Tianlan's voice was as cold as ice. Li Huaqing narrowed his eyes and stopped in his tracks, looking at the hidden ocean in front of him. Under the wind and snow, the surface of the Hidden Dragon Sea was calm. I can ask him to apologize to you, of course, in private, but the cabinet will increase its support for Emperor Dong's palace in the future. In addition, the prime minister has been too busy recently. His health isn't very good either, so he can go to the south to recuperate. Zheng Yang can temporarily take charge of the cabinet's affairs. I believe that Comrade Wu Jingmin can become Zheng Yang's right-hand man. Li Tianlan glanced at him. He didn't care about private apologies. No matter how humble Qin Fangqing was, it was meaningless. But to increase the support for Emperor Dong's palace, it had to be done. With less than a year to go before the election, asking Qin Fangqing to recuperate in the south was basically equivalent to an early retirement. The second prime minister, Hua Jingyang, was in charge of the cabinet's work, and the deputy prime minister, Wu Zhengmin, was further promoted to the second prime minister, which was equivalent to a director's position. There is no doubt that this was the offer of the academics, and also an explanation that Zhongzhou State intended to give Li Tianlan. A director's position, this was the most important bargaining chip. Neither Li Huaqing nor Li Tianlan worried about whether these things would become a reality. Not to mention the academics that Li Huaqing completely controlled and the giant group that fully supported Li Tianlan. Even within the prince group, dissatisfaction with Chen Fangqing had reached the limit after the blockade operation failed. This failure not only put Chen Fangqing's position in jeopardy, but also the leaders of the prince group were psychologically prepared for the great loss of vitality of the group. The prince group just wanted to let this matter pass as soon as possible and reach a new balance, so it was impossible for them to oppose Wu Zhengmin. Therefore, in Li Huaqing's words, although the director's position was an important bargaining chip, the focus was on Hua Jingyang. This was a deal. Li Huaqing was almost certain to be re-elected, and Hua Jingyang was the vice prime minister of Zhongzhou State, so he also had one more term. However, it seemed that the academics were no longer satisfied with the position of the vice prime minister. Now, they wanted to take this opportunity to promote Hua Jingyang. Li Tianlan needed the support of the academics. And on the matter of Hua Jingyang, the academics also needed the support of Li Tianlan and the giant group. Once the academics succeeded, the president and the prime minister of Zhongzhou State would be in the academics, and the academics would enter a period of real strength. Li Tianlan was expressionless and silent. When talking to a leader like Li Huaqing, the other party would not point out a lot of things. If he could not consider any point, he might suffer a loss. To be honest, Li Tianlan was really not used to this kind of communication. He had a headache talking for a while, but at least for the time being, he could not change anything. Li Huaqing quietly waited for Li Tianlan's answer. I don't need his apology. Li Tianlan thought for a long time and said slowly. Li Huaqing frowned slightly and waited patiently for a few seconds to make sure that Li Tianlan had finished what he wanted to say. He just didn't need to apologize. He didn't mention anything about the arrangement of the cabinet. If he didn't mention it, he wouldn't express his position. To be exact, he didn't agree. He didn't agree to let Hua Jingyang control the cabinet. Li Huaqing's eyes gradually became dignified. If it was before, Li Tianlan's was not important at all. But at this time, if Li Tianlan said no to Hua Jingyang really couldn't do it. The war in the desert was over. Chen Fangqing had been in a desperate situation where there was no retreat. He was bound to fight desperately and use all his means to find some opportunities in the dying struggle. Under such circumstances, Li Tianlan not only had the full support of the giant group behind him, but also the Wang family of Beihai, who wanted to stabilize the situation with the help of Li Tianlan and Emperor Dong's palace, would also agree to Li Tianlan's request. The honeymoon period between the giant group and the southeast group would not change at least before this election. If Li Tianlan said no, then, unless Li Huaqing was willing to join hands with the prince group to set off another game, it really wouldn't work. Fortunately, Li Tianlan didn't say yes, but he didn't say no either. Did this mean that there was still hope? He thought for a moment and said slowly, "What do you think about the prime minister?" This was undoubtedly a test. He started with Chen Fangqing and slowly transitioned to the cabinet to sound out Li Tianlan's conditions. For people at Li Huaqing's level, there was nothing that couldn't be discussed. It was nothing more than checks and balances from various perspectives. But Li Tianlan really didn't want Hua Jingyang to control the cabinet. It was impossible for him to agree to this matter. Perhaps in Li Huaqing's view, giving the giant group a director position was already very sincere, but Li Tianlan didn't think so. In Li Huaqing's mind, Wu Zhengmin becoming a director was tantamount to adding a heavyweight position to the giant group. The current giant group belonged to Dongqing Wudi. The future belonged to Li Tianlan. All Dongqing Wudi's actions in the past 2 years showed this. But that wasn't what Li Tianlan wanted. What he wanted was a group of his own. There might be a group of people added from the giant group, but what he wanted was a brand new group that belonged to him, one that could help the giant group but could stand firm in Zhongzhou State on its own. For such a large group, a director position was necessary. In Li Tianlan's mind, the ideal candidate was also Wu Zhengmin. Wu Zhengmin was the best choice in terms of ability and experience. The only drawback was that he was a little old and could only serve for one more term. Li Tianlan hoped that Wu Zhengmin could take this position, and naturally, he also hoped that he could use this term to formally build the structure of the new group. But if Hua Jingyang controlled the cabinet, and Li Huaqing was the president, Wu Zhengmin's pressure could be imagined, and he wouldn't even have much room to play. Li Tianlan absolutely didn't want to see this situation. I don't have any ideas. Li Tianlan shook his head slowly. It was not suitable for him to say too much to Li Huaqing today, and Li Huaqing wouldn't say too much to him either. This game that started 2 years ago had gone on until now. Although the situation was clear, the final result had not appeared. In other words, there were still many variables. The termination plan was exposed, and the Desert War came to an end. Li Tianlan reappeared in Yuzhou, which was a stage victory. But no one could say that Chen Fangqing was really on the road to death. After all, the decisive battle in Beihai had not yet begun. If Chen Fangqing defeated the Wang family of Beihai in one fell swoop, the situation would undoubtedly become more complicated. But in the current situation, Chen Fangqing didn't have many chances. It was also because of this that Li Huaqing would meet Li Tianlan. What Li Tianlan needed was Li Huaqing's attitude, and Li Huaqing also gave a clear attitude. For Li Tianlan, this was enough. He still had too many things to consider about what the new group would be like. He looked at the flying snow in front of him and said calmly, "He did something I don't want to see, so I will naturally do something he doesn't want to see." "What is it?" Li Huaqing asked subconsciously. Li Tianlan laughed. In the wind and snow, his smiling face was a little cold and ferocious. His termination plan failed. Do you think my termination plan will succeed? That you're tuning in to the Romance Rendezvous YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.